Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon session of the day 2 of OSSAN conference. So far, we have discussed advantages of open science. Then in the morning session, we had looked into this exciting case of Maker's Asylum, which is another dimension of open science. And it shows why we don't always need to patent to claim the credits of an innovation or priority over a knowledge. Now we are back to the question of seamless access to knowledge again, because this is such an important question in the academic ecosystem. Now, academic publishers are so far been an integral part when knowledge dissemination is concerned. So what are they bringing into the debate of seamless access to knowledge? Now we have a workshop led by Dr. Jan Potter, who is the Director of Business Development Frontiers. A little bit about Jan. So Jan started his career in research exploring the molecular mechanism of plant growth. He left academia to begin a career in scholarly publishing, initially with a leading society journal and then to Blackwell Publishing to work on a portfolio of medical titles, increasingly engaged in publishing technology projects. Jan then left Blackwell in 2003 to join a small US publishing technology company, ScholarOne, producing what came to be one of the leading manuscript submission platform for scholarly publisher. ScholarOne was acquired by Thomson in 2006, later the Thomson Reuters. As part of Thomson, Jan continued as key account manager for strategic clients before moving to a business development and internal consulting role across the product portfolio. More recently, Jan moved from consulting role to develop a range of standalone publisher analytics for Clarivate, and then to the Insights platform team, where he led product strategy and development for the benchmarking and analytics platform. Jan joined Frontiers in September 2021 to lead their business intelligence department. And we in the academic system are very much informed about the tools of Clarivate or Impact Factor or SiteScore and everything. And that plays a very important role in the career progression, even if we like it or not. So now I would hand over the floor to Jan. Jan, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm assuming you'll need me to share my screen. So bear with me for a second. One moment. Can I confirm you're seeing my presentation?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Well, thank you and welcome everyone today. And also thanks to OSSAN and the Indian Institute of Science for inviting me today. So what I want to talk about is how publishing open access can improve the impact of your research. So I will ask a couple of questions in a moment about the audience, but firstly, just some remarks about myself. Thank you for the update to my career. I've been with Frontiers as Director of Business Intelligence for just about a year now, so it's a relatively new role for me. I lead a large team at Frontiers, so we have approximately 20 people that look at both the internal analytics, but also external analytics too. So we look at a lot of publishing, we look a lot about what motivates authors to publish in our publications. And just a few words about Frontiers. So we are a fully open access publisher. So everything that we publish is open, and I'll talk about what openness means in some later slides. And we're mission driven. So we believe that science should be open. We think it's key to progression. We have a lot of existential issues at the moment. So think about climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution. Think more immediately about COVID and just the impact of being able to publish openly, people being able to see that research, cite that research has been massive. And our belief at Frontiers is this needs to happen. We're not the only open access publisher, and I think many will will share the way that we look at things, but this is really our passion. And we think by being open, we can start to reverse these things. We can contribute more successfully to this research. And it requires collaboration. So we need authors to publish openly. I mean, this is the way it all works. So that's really our social purpose, is to make everything open. So that's our focus. That's what I'm going to talk about a lot today. It won't just be about frontiers. Like I say, other publishers do support open access too. And today's thrust is what the benefits of open access is, what you should be looking for when you publish open access. We'll have a couple of polls in there, just to get some information about yourselves and some of the perceptions that you would like. Also, I would like to give you the opportunity to ask questions. I know it can be somewhat difficult in a virtual format, but we're going to try to make it as interactive as possible. And certainly if the organisers could keep an eye on the chat, then we'll pause periodically to answer those questions. So don't be shy about asking questions. We'd love to get your feedback. We'd love to get your participation in this. So let me kick things off. So I always like to know a little bit about the audience so we can make sure we're communicating at the same level, but also just curiosity. I'm always interested to see who is attending these and what they're looking to get out of the meeting. So we have two polls here. Are the organisers going to run these polls? So just do poll 1, then poll 2, please.
Yes, we will run it from our side. Jana, can you please put the poll up?
So let's just give people a few minutes. I'll just talk about why I'm asking this question. So obviously knowing which of you are early career researchers, and in that case, you probably publish between sort of 1 and 5 papers. It's the start of your research career. Some of you may be longer termers and veterans in your research careers, in which case you may be in the latter categories. And some of you may be thinking about publishing for the first time. Going back in time and thinking about when I first started my career as an academic, I think it was during my PhD that I first published a paper. And the world was very different back then. There wasn't really a concept of open access. I'm obviously not as young as I used to be. So it wasn't an option back then, but now it is more of an option. And we'll talk a bit about funding and how people pay for these later. But it's always interesting to know quite where you are in that career progression. And the second question, which will come up in a moment, we'll ask a bit about open access too. So I think we might have enough answers to this one. So if we could then skip to poll 2 just to get the data for that one too, that would be fantastic.
Jana, end this poll and go to the,
And then if we could just review both outcomes, we'll do the first one, question 1 first, and question 2.
So question 2 is up.
So just select the one here, which most, if you have published open access before, and if you haven't. Again, it's useful to know how many of you have had an open access publication. Be interesting in the chat if it's something you thought of doing, you would like to do, but you are perhaps blocked by funding or you're not quite sure where to go. Do pop any of those into the chat if necessary. So I think this one's probably quite a quick one. Let's just give it a few more seconds for those answers to come in. Okay, if answers are not coming in, could we go and review what the results were for the question 1, please?
Jana, maybe you can then share the post.
Oh, that's it. I can see it. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's quite interesting. So around a fifth of you have not submitted a paper before. So today, hopefully, will be quite informative. I think it'll be informative for everyone. Hopefully, that's my aim today. 1 to 5 is around half of you. So you are established in your publishing, well, I should say, research careers, and you have published some papers. So you certainly have some insights into the process itself and what goes into writing, publishing, going through the review process, and finally getting to see your work in print. I'm pleased and surprised to see that around a third of you have published more than 10 papers. So honestly, you're experts. Maybe you'll have some feedback for me today. So I'm looking forward to seeing your participation. Could we skip over to question 2, please? This will be interesting to see. Oh, well, that's really fantastic, actually. So 80% of you, so what's that? 4/5 of you have actually already published open access. So hopefully some of you with Frontiers, but I'm sure some of our competitors too. But still around 1/5 of you have not published any open access before. I didn't ask the question, but it'd be interesting to know how many of you who are new to publishing or have only published a few papers, whether you've gone preferentially for open access or whether you're more established and you're in that latter range where you publish more than 10 papers, how much of that content's been open access? I'll talk a bit about how open access is growing in the next couple of slides. But thank you for running those two questions. We'll have some more questions later in the session. Like I say, do feel free to ask questions. I'm not sure if we have any questions at the moment. Is there anything in the chat, or I can just get started?
I think you can get started, nothing in the chat, but I would request the participants to put this question on the chat. For example, in Indian context, we don't have funding for APC for sure. So maybe the open access publishing that has came from our audience, I mean, the South Asian audience, I would, maybe they can say, what are the journal? Is the local journals that we are talking about? Because from India, there are quality journal run by the Academy of Sciences, which publishes open access. So that maybe participants can give that information in the chat or question answer section.
It would be really good to discuss those regional contexts. So, you know, what is stopping you publishing open access? If you have published open access, what did you find successful and beneficial? It'd be good to have a few user perspectives on this. I mean, I can present it from my perspective, but I'm obviously not from the region. I've traveled and presented extensively, but that's not quite the same thing. I've always published in very Western journals, and certainly my publishing career was some years before open access really became a thing.
I will request Janet to stop share this poll. I think we are done, so we can close this.
Yeah, if we could stop that now, and I'll step into the presentation, and I'll let you know the next questions come up. So I think we have a snapshot about today's audience. We're just going through the two polls. So I want to just talk about what is open access, just to make sure that we're all in the same place, and start to introduce some of the benefits of open access. So the next slide, I'll take you through some of the things that characterize open access, and we'll start to introduce some of the benefits of open access. And then we'll take a bit of a step back just to talk about publishing in general, because one thing that I do want to emphasize is that open access is still academic publishing. It's equivalent to publishing in a closed access journal. What's really changed is the way that the payment happens. And we'll talk a bit about payment and what the importance is, and where the money comes from, and why that's important as well. Because, you know, a big argument is, why can you not simply put your paper in a repository and, you know, job done? And publishers do have some value. Obviously, I'm a bit biased there, as I come from a publisher, but I've seen things from both sides of the fence. So I've been an academic. I've also then worked for a publisher, then I've worked for a technology company, and then I've come back to working now for a publisher. So I've kind of been on both sides of that fence. And I will say I have a strong understanding of how publishers work and what they do behind the scenes. And I don't have the slide actually, but many years ago, I did put together a slide which covered what publishers do, all the different activities that happen from receiving an article all the way through its final publication. And I think at the last count, and there is also a post on the Scholarly Kitchen blog, if you're familiar with it, publishers do around 102 different things. And they all take a lot of technology, a lot of investment in research and infrastructure. Just to take a little case study here, just think about, you know, every article these days needs a DOI, which is just a unique identifier document that links through to that document. All those things have to be set up. Things have to be hosted and linked and everything else. All these things need to happen, and they need to be done by someone. And when we talk a bit about where the money goes, we'll talk a bit about how these things are funded and why it's important to have money, be it from open access publishing, so the APC fees or some kind of institutional payment scheme, or the traditional way, which is subscription publishing. And in that case, the libraries are paying for this, but it means it then becomes more difficult to access. So hopefully you can see some of this. This is actually an older slide that I did some years ago when I talked about this in my last role at Clarivate, but it's still quite relevant at the moment. And let me just introduce what the problem is with access. So at the moment, if you want to access a paper, you've got to find it. Now, there are various ways to find things. Obviously, the most simple way is to look at your institutional library. It will have a subscription to that journal, and you can then go ahead and access it in the normal way. With more and more journals being published, that's becoming more of a challenge. And, you know, you need to be at a well-funded institution. Even big institutions like consortia, like the California Digital Libraries, have issues affording everything. Even if you're Harvard or one of those top-tier institutions in the US that have, let's face it, a fair amount of financial backing, still have trouble subscribing to everything. The number of journals, for instance, with companies like Elsevier is huge. So nobody gets access to everything, not even in the developed world. It's getting more and more challenging. And if if you're not an academic and you just want to have access to the literature, it's a struggle. And even then, if you do get access, then there's limits to what you can do with that. Now, I will say, obviously, there are ways which are less than legal to access content, and I'm sure you're familiar with those. There's been many items of controversy, but you shouldn't be forced to, access content in mechanisms that are illegal from, websites hosted potentially in Russia and places like that. So, it's fair enough to say you should be able to get legitimate access to published articles. So permissions, the ability to use your own content. I mean, what typically happens at the moment with a subscription journal is you sign over your copyright to that publisher. Now, they'll look after it for you. It's not that they're taking it and then repurposing your work or doing anything nefarious with that work. But it means that you lose control. In reality, they're not going to stop you using your content, but they could do because it's no longer your content. You've given them your copyright. Another thing about access is discoverability. It's the ability to find something. Now, libraries make that certainly easier. They mostly have their search tools, their catalog tools. More increasingly now, people just type something into a Google search field, and we'll talk about that later. But content needs to be discoverable. And this is actually key to your impact. If you think about things, if you can't find your research, then you're not going to get cited, you're not going to have any kind of impact. And openness is key to that because it becomes easier to discover things. You're not reliant on a library catalog or digging into an expensive system like the Web of Science or Scopus to find things. Accessibility is more of a general thing. Obviously for people, let's just take the example of somebody who has reduced vision, to be able to get access content in a way that is available to screen readers and other accessibility tools is important. This is not key to open access, although open access publishers have been at the vanguard of making sure their content is accessible. But it's very important that everybody gets access to your content. And if they can't access it in a particular format, they can't use their screen readers, then again, they can't use your content. Language is just something to touch on as well. I think you all know that the majority of scholarly publishing is still English language. That's not something that's changed in recent years. It's not looking to change. I appreciate it's a challenge, but open access does give you the ability to publish it in other languages if you need to. But again, open access hasn't really changed the kind of lingua franca of scholarly publishing at the moment. One final thing to touch on open access, and certainly putting into the context of sort of global geopolitics, is that it's easy for libraries and institutions and governments to restrict what's seen. There's lots of stories, and let's pick on the United States here, where content is it's being restricted by libraries because it doesn't, it conflicts with current political thinking. And if you think of some of the more progressive human rights issues and things like that, it's not something that just happens in the developing world. This is something which is key in the developed world now. Obviously, a lot of political changes over the years, a lot of the ways that societal issues are being viewed means that it's quite possible for people to restrict content if it's only controlled locally. And by making content open, actually, it just get around a lot of that censorship. Obviously, websites can be blocked and those things still come to pass. But generally, if something's open, it becomes more accessible. That content can be reused. It can be abstracted en masse by machines. So machines can take all that content and host it elsewhere. And when we talk about licensing, we'll talk a bit about why open licensing is important. So just stepping through to getting a manuscript accepted. So you've published, you've submitted your manuscript, it's been published. You can go a couple of different places. And I want to just introduce the different concepts of openness, just so everybody's on the same page here. So you've got your papers being accepted. You can, of course, put that into a repository. That's the green blob there towards the top. That's a good thing to do anyway. Many institutions have repositories. There's also the big PMC, so the PubMed Central repositories. So there's lots of places to host content. Most publishers will allow you to put your content into a repository. Sometimes it's not the final version. Sometimes it's just the accepted versions that haven't gone through the publisher's copy editing and layout and other activities. There's generally an embargo on this too. And there's always been some tension about how long that embargo should be. Many publishers have pushed for 12 months. So from the publication of your article to when it appears in a repository should be 12 months. Many funding agencies who mandate that content should be publicly accessible, and I'll talk about what the difference between public and open access is in a moment, have pushed for 6 months, and now the push is for immediate access. You might have seen statements from the US government recently that content should be immediately accessible in a repository. So you don't get the value adds of what publishers are adding necessarily, although you do get the benefits of peer review process, and your content gets to be open. Whether or not it's discoverable is a bit more challenging. It depends on the repository and how easy it is to find that data. The next step from that is a gold open access journal. That's the business that Frontiers is in. This is what we believe is a good, solid funding model for open access publishing, which is typically the payment of an APC, so an article processing charge. So there is a fee that is paid by the authors. Typically in the developed world, not by the authors, but by their funding agencies. So funding agencies are paying for this. And this covers the costs of turning that submitted article into the final accepted article, all the technology and the discoverability that I'll talk about later that goes into this. The second option is just a variant on gold. So we at Frontiers are entirely gold. So everything that we publish is gold. So it's paid for by an APC or one of those institutional charges that we've agreed with the institution or the agency. Hybrid is gold in an existing subscription journal. So if you publish in a subscription journal, you have the option to publish your article gold. Again, you're paying an APC. I'll show this later. Typically, those APCs to publish in these journals tend to be higher because it's an established journal. Think about the fees for publishing in, say, Nature. Springer recently upgraded their APCs for hybrid gold in their Nature titles, and those are the ones which came out around, I think it's around $11,500, which, as you can imagine, are extremely high fees to get into those journals. So it's an option that's offered in many journals and by most publishers these days. It is the same as gold by terms of access and everything else, but it allows somebody to publish open access in an established journal. There are some challenges with that. It does allow publishers to sometimes what's called double dipping. So people pay an APC, but then libraries are also paying the subscription fees. So although many publishers will take efforts not to take payment twice, it's hard to establish how those fees work out and whether or not they are getting additional revenue by publishing both models. And also there's an argument that by publishing hybrid by letting people publish in their journals and pay an APC fee, they're not really committing to open access, and not in the way that a company like Frontiers has, where we think everything should be open. It's more of a financial way of looking at things. So they're going to take the money because they know people want to publish open access, but they're not really committing to open access. They're not committing to that mission of open science. There's a subset of this for subscription journals where content is just released after a period of time. In those cases, they just after 12 months or after a set period of time, after an embargo period, they make content available to read. It's not necessarily open access at that point. It's just that you can read it without going through the paywall. Different publishers have different policies. Different journals have different policies around this. So you will find quite often that some older material, in some cases, some publishers do take initial material that's just been published and have a short window where it's freely available. But generally, that's called delayed or embargoed publication. There's lots of color schemes for this. I'm going to keep it simple for today. And then finally, at the bottom there, obviously, we have the subscription journals. Many leading journals are still subscription only. They may have those hybrid fees where you can get your open access into them, but they're still driven by the subscription model. Obviously, this is a model that goes back to the very first journals back in the 16th, 17th century. So it's established. And I will say that in 2022, and just looking back at the last 5 years, even though gold has started to grow, 2/3 of published research is still behind a paywall, at least for most of its lifespan. It may be released later, just to be publicly accessible in the mode that I just mentioned. But the majority of research is still behind a paywall, and you cannot immediately and legally access that. So you're going to talk a little bit about what makes something open, and just the distinction between public access and open access. So public access means you can see it, you can read it, you can find it in a website, you don't have to pay any money to a publisher, you don't need to go for a library or institutional subscription. It's there for you to read, but it's not open. The key thing about open is that it has a license that makes it open. That license means that you remain the owner of that work, and that license means that you can use your research as you see fit. So you can distribute it, you can share it, you can add it to a monograph or a collection, you can put it into repositories, you can do anything that you want to do with it. And that's a key thing, actually, because if it's just public access, you don't necessarily have those rights. Those rights still belong to the publisher. That data cannot then be abstracted and used in other analyses, not without permission of that publisher, who are then the rights holders. So think about it, if you write a book, you would anticipate you would want to keep the copyright to your book and determine how your work would be used in future. That's not the way it works for most subscription publishing. You lose access to that. Now, the most typical license at the moment, you might be familiar with this, is the Creative Commons license. The CC BY license, there are several additions to that. Certainly everything that Frontiers publish is CC BY, which basically means there's no restrictions on it. Beyond the fact that that work should still be attributed to you as the authors. But beyond that, it can be reused in any ways that it should be reused. There are obviously additions to that which other publishers may have, which limit the way that work can be commercialized, whether bits can be pulled out and used in different ways. But generally, there should be an attribution to your work, but it can be taken. So if somebody else wants to host Frontiers content, they can take our content, they can put it into their own repository, they can host it, they can run machine learning across that to get additional insights from all the published work. And we encourage those things. That's all falls into the remit of openness. So that's kind of an overview of what open access is, the different modes of publishing. I apologize to anybody that's already super familiar with this, but I think it's good to have a good grounding of what we're talking about here and what open access is before we get into the weeds of how you can benefit from open access and what to look for in an open access journal. Were there any questions in the chat about this before I move on? I assume from silence that you will have a good understanding of what open access is.
Yeah, there are no questions.
Okay, thank you. So firstly, let me just talk about why publish open access. Then we'll get into a bit more detail. And I've touched on this in the last slide, but I want to bring these key concepts to the surface because these influence the way that you get impact. And the first one is visibility. If nobody can see your work, then it's not going to get viewed, it's not going to get read, it's not going to get cited, and you're not going to get impact. So when somebody's locked behind a paywall, access is then determined, the gatekeepers then become the libraries and institutions. And only those libraries and institutions that have subscribed, the people that belong to those, are affiliated with those institutions, can access your work. So if you get published in the top journal in the world, it doesn't mean that people are going to access it. And particularly if you're from other regions like today, then you may not have access to these journals. In which case your colleagues, the people at your institutions, the people in your region cannot necessarily access this content. So it's a case of visibility, is making it available to everyone that wants to read it. I touched on machine readability. Again, that's that ability to take content and use it elsewhere, to host it elsewhere, to gain additional insights. And this is becoming quite an increasing thing as people looking at a whole cohorts of data, running them through these machine learning algorithms. This is something that my team do at the moment, to really sort of do these kind of automated meta-analyses of data. And that adds value to what you're publishing, because by getting it into this mix, it means your results are considered in bigger studies. It's brought together into a larger, more visible cohort of research. And it lets people do a lot more things. You can't do this with a paywall journal because that content is not accessible unless the publisher deems that they want to make that content accessible. So everything has to be done on a per use case. If you want to tomorrow, just take all Frontiers content from our website. We'll help you do that because as part of our mission, we want you to be able to use our content. And that moves on to the concept of impact there. And you won't get impact, and we'll talk about how we define impact later, unless somebody can freely read, download, and cite your work. Otherwise, they can't do it, or they're reliant on some second-hand view of your work. And again, to come back to the final concept of sharing, Open isn't just free to read. Open is to be able to use that content. So the licensing that I just talked about means that we can do all these wonderful things. And because you retain the ownership, you can actually start to market your own content too. You can share it with anyone. You can send copies to anyone. You can send it out by your social media feeds. You can use it in all the various social media contexts that you want to. You can pop it into your institutional repositories. You can add it to your lab web pages, all those wonderful things that give you additional output. You can become your own marketing, but you shouldn't have to be. Publishers should help with that too. So let me put Open into a bit of context here. This slightly complicated graph here just shows growth in publishing output. This uses data from Dimensions, which is a digital science product which tracks publication metrics over time. And this goes back to 2010. And one thing you'll see here is there's more publishing output. People are publishing more each year. And obviously, given the last couple of years of COVID, there's been a lot more. There's been a little push in output. So I'll say a little push, a large push in COVID-related papers. But I would ask you to focus there on the green and gold bars at the bottom, because this is growing as well. This is the open access content. And you see this is growing. It's actually growing more rapidly. So although there's been growth over the last 10 years, around 8.5% in total publishing output, because more research is being done. That's grown disproportionately as gold and gold hybrid there, which is running around 20% at the moment. So more and more content is becoming open, but it's still not the most amount of content. Still 2/3 is behind that paywall. And certainly at Frontiers, we're super keen to push for more content to be gold, and that's our mission. We want more of that content to be gold and to be available to everyone. This will continue to change. You see a basic forecast there. There's a little drop in 2022, which may or may not happen. That's just with less COVID research being published as we hopefully get to the end steps of the pandemic. Perhaps I'm speaking prematurely there, but I'm hoping we do see the back of that. But then things will continue to pick up, and these growth rates will continue. So we'll still have a lot of publishing happening. So gold, we believe strongly, is the future, but we have a way to go before most of the content is published gold. There will eventually be an inflection point where there's more content published in gold journals than there will be in subscription journals, but that's going to take a while to happen. I want to stress this is international. So this slide here just shows it's probably of no surprise to anyone here that we're still strongly driven by Europe, China, particularly China in recent years, where there's been a massive growth in publication output, particularly in international journals, and then the US and Canada. Those are the established players. They contribute most publication outputs. Also, most of the citation activity, understandably, goes to the same people. So there is that, I hesitate to say, closed loop of established research, but let's not forget the rest of the world. But you'll see here, this is growing. Well, you won't see it's growing here, but you see that there's a substantial contribution. It is growing. So obviously Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. But put the focus there on India. A lot more content is coming from India. South America too, Africa, the rest of the world. We don't have data for everyone. But if you add all those up together, which I haven't done, it's substantial. Just adding, India, South America together, it's a substantial proportion of, for instance, China. So this is happening. And you'll see on the next slide, actually, that a lot of this is actually going preferentially into open access journals. So in many ways, regions outside the established Western developed world are driving open access. And in some ways, it's often thought of as being, open access is generally thought of, well, often thought of, perhaps mistakenly, as being a developed world phenomenon because they have the costs to pay for this. That's not actually the case. It is driven actually by other regions. It's far more equitable when it comes to regional participation than is in the more established journals. So one final slide here before I pause for questions. This is just a view that I pulled from a paper in PLOS One itself, an open access journal. And you can see here, I can go ahead and reuse this content with a little attribution here. This color coding here is just showing, and the paper's linked there, so you can go ahead and view it. Just showing who's participating in open access. So the darker the color basically is the more open access publishing that they're doing. The lighter the color is, the darker the green the color is the less participation in open access publishing. It's slightly normalized by the methodology that the authors use, but this just gives, I'm not going to go into details, and this gives a nice view of who's contributing to open access. And you'll see, it's not necessarily the countries you would expect. Certainly there are some countries in Europe there which are participating, Germany, Austria, Slovenia. This is testing my, actually I think that's Hungary. This is testing my geographical knowledge here. Italy are contributing. The UK, sadly enough, as somebody from the UK, is not pushing it as hard as you might think there. It's not doing terribly well at all. Same with the US, actually. But there's a lot of growth in Iran. Maybe we shouldn't talk about Russia at the moment, India. So it is a mix across the world in how people are participating. But just to come back to that 20% growth figure, that is across the world. That is an average, but every country is pushing more of their content into open access. So open access, I'm going to say this from my bias is coming from Frontiers. Open access is the future, and we think gold open access is the future. So I'm going to just stop a moment there, as I see there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. Let me see if I can open this.
Okay, I can read it for you, if that helps. So because the first question,
if you want to, yeah, if you want to ask those questions, then I'll answer them.
Okay, so yeah, maybe it would be good to take the question at this moment. So
yeah.
So because you were showing that with the open access publishing, the citation grows much more, or view downloads and everything. So I think this question actually relates to that can the publisher game this metrics and show something that is not real?
That's a good question. Obviously, coming from the company that used to have the general impact factor, well, it still has the general impact factor. There are certainly ways that any number can be gamed to a degree. Once you have a target, then, as you know, behavior then becomes orientated to hitting that target. Generally, with views, downloads, and citations, and I'll talk about some of the metrics later. It's difficult to game them in any meaningful way because you have little control. Now, obviously, there are mechanisms such as citation stacking and just general aberrant citation behavior where groups of people align themselves to cite their own papers, those kinds of things do happen. It's something that certainly Frontiers is very cognizant of, and we look as well. I mean, all publishers now invest significantly in trying to make sure that these things don't happen, and papers that are found to fall into these categories do get retracted. Also, for companies like Clarivate and Elsevier that host these metrics, dig deeply into looking to see if these gaming strategies are actually happening. And they have some very sophisticated machine learning based tools to look at this. So anybody that is tempted into doing these kinds of things, it's generally relatively easy to find. It can result in a journal being disqualified from getting metrics in future. It can also increasingly result in sanctions for the authors too. They certainly will be barred from publishing it in a particular journal, particularly if it's a high quality journal. And I'll talk about what makes quality in a moment. So yes, you can game these metrics, but I would say there is a substantial hazard in doing so. But generally for the raw metrics, such as just the views, downloads, because they come from publisher sites, they're typically not gamed. They're just recording the clicks that happen. So there's not a lot that can be done to manipulate those. I think that might have answered the question, but
yeah, I think, yeah, but obviously there would always be a little bit of questions. But anyway, so the next question that we have is that how do you ensure the quality peer review? Because that is one of the places that people will think that that's the most important part of the publishing. That makes it different from the preprint. So how do you ensure that is the quality?
This is one of the value adds that the publishers add to the mix. This is something I'll flag later. There's something you need to reassure yourself of. If you're submitting to a journal, you want to be sure that they have a good, strong, robust peer review system. And this can be difficult to understand because, you know, this is behind a wall effectively. You don't know what's happening at a publisher. And there's no easy way to see this, and it all feeds into the journal's reputation itself. I'll talk a little bit later on a future slide about some of the things you should look for in peer review. But yeah, this is important. And just to talk about this from Frontier's perspective, but I will say it is shared with other publishers that I've worked at. There's a whole team behind the scenes that manages this process. At Frontiers, we have an interactive open review process. So it's collaborative. You can see what other reviewers are saying. You can see the editor comments and everything else. So you actually do have a window into how that's happening. So you would see the comments from reviewers. We also publish that on our web pages too. So we publish who the editors were, if necessary, who the reviewers were. All that data is available. And this is not a Frontiers only phenomenon. Lots of other publishers are doing similar things. So BMJ, for instance, a British medical journal, and the other journals that they publish as part of their portfolio have also typically done this. It's often known as open review, where the comments are published, sometimes with an attribution to an individual. Sometimes it is blinded because obviously when people are peer reviewing a paper, they want to make sure that they can be objective, and if their name's published with that can be a bit challenging in their objectivity. They may feel that they're going to upset somebody, there may be some sort of career comeback or something like that. So this is happening more and more. At Frontiers, we do audit our peer review processes. So we have a peer review integrity team. They use a lot of those tools I talked about to make sure that people aren't, there is a scam where people review their own papers. This has happened when I worked in the Scholar One space, where we found that what was happening was people were creating dummy accounts and then suggesting themselves these dummy accounts as being a reviewer on their own paper, which, as you can imagine, is something of a conflict of interest. So what was happening there was the editors were going, well, they've suggested somebody to be a reviewer. I'll just pick this person, and it was, Joe Smith at google.com or something like that. But then what they're actually doing, we're actually assigning the author to review their own paper. No surprises there that their verdict was published as quickly as possible. It's fantastic. So spotting those kinds of things is an ongoing thing that needs to happen. And this is what, there's a a resource cost at publishers and an actual financial cost in doing this, making sure those teams are available. So I'll come back to peer review later, but yeah, this is something you should look for. You should validate when you're publishing in any journal, to be quite honest, but certainly for open access too.
The third question is much more overarching. Maybe I will take it up much in the later stage, but a fourth one I would just like to ask, because the current slide that you are showing itself shows that as the darker is, that it's more open access. So obviously India falls where there are a lot of publications are open access already, but there is a concern that like globally also it's something that we hear that it's not good quality publication, because in India also the top institutions publish with the well-known commercial publishers. So here I assume that the Indian journals are the one which, because of those, we publish actually a lot of open access content. But then is it a problem of the visibility, because these are not probably indexed in the Web of Sciences Scopus? Or what do you think, why it is that these are not been very visible or not doesn't get much citation and all?
I think you hit the key thing there, which is visibility. So yes, you can publish open or public access regionally, but then it's not being seen by this. There's always many countries have developed their own repositories. Not just India, places like France and other places have their national level repositories where they have the well-meaning aim of making sure that all research content is freely accessible. But it's why it's there, there's no discoverability to this. So it's hard to find that content. So if you're publishing in a national repository, then that's fine for your region perhaps, but it's not being seen by researchers in, for instance, North America or maybe Europe, because they won't be looking into this data. And unless it's brought to the surface in general search engines like Google Scholar or something like that, it won't typically be seen. And also you touched on the other point there, where these journals are not indexed in the main sources. Now, I know there's a lot of debate and controversy around getting indexed, particularly around getting journal impact factors and things like that. But this does mean that something becomes visible. If it's available in the Clarivate indices, so the Science Citation Index Expanded or the Emerging Sources Citation Index, or if it's in Scopus or Medline and places like that, then it becomes more discoverable. This is actually of key importance, because otherwise you've effectively put it onto a website. There's not necessarily going to be discoverable data. It's accessible, but not discoverable. And I'll touch again on this in a later slide. Okay, I think we've covered the questions for now, but do keep the questions coming in. They're very informative and I love answering them. So let me just step forward now and just talk about what you should expect from an open access journal. My mouse. Quick answer to this one, I will go into a bit more detail. Is everything a subscription journal offers. It's not a lower quality outcome. All that's happened really is the way that it's paid for has changed, so the business model. So you should expect exactly the same treatment, exactly the same standards, exactly the same publication output, if not better. So it's not a second-class option. It's an equivalent, if not better. So could we switch to the next poll now? So poll 3. And you can choose more than one of these if you want to, but I'm interested to know what the aim of publishing your work is. So there's a couple of reasons why people publish things. Some are more mercenary, so career progression, getting future grants, totally legitimate. I know that a lot of my publishing output back in the day was driven by making sure I had a good portfolio of publications to get future grants, but also to satisfy my grant agencies at the time. When I did research, I was paid for in the US by the Department of Energy, and they were very exacting about what they expected to get out of the grant that they'd given me. And I don't imagine that's different in the rest of the world. But also, I mean, there is a more collegiate approach where you just want to get your work seen. You want to add to the corpus of scientific information, you want to benefit your colleagues, etc., etc. And then there's a wider perspective as well, where we think about, how does research contribute to the world? You think about, let's think about global warming and climate change and things like that. You want your research to have some formative addition to that research and to influence policy as well. I mean, what your country's policy is towards things like net zero and things like that, you want to, add to that evidence base. So if we've got enough answers in now, maybe we could just take a look at what the audience has been saying. Do we have the answers now?
Yes, we have enough. So this is the.
Okay, thank you very much.
So shall we share the results now?
I can see the results. So this is quite interesting, actually. So no big surprise, you want to get recognition and career progression. Obviously, as any academic in any part of the world, you are essentially driven by the fact that you want to move forward. You want to get, you want to see yourself rise in your departments. This is very driven, for instance, in places like the United States, where there's the concept of tenure track, where you establish yourself well enough in a department, you're effectively given a job. Otherwise, you're still tied to funding, you're forced to move around and those kinds of things. And that's common throughout much of the world. So getting yourself into a place where you have the security of a job is also super interesting. Interesting to see how many are very keen to find future collaborators and promote your work. So, and I think in part that's to a degree internationalization. By having a wider range of collaborators, you're bringing more into your research. But also internationalization is a key to visibility and getting more impact. Something which is purely regional might be of interest to the region, but having a wider perspective actually brings in a lot more interest. And I will say that internationalization of an author list leads to a lot more visibility and impact. Surprisingly, less emphasis on meeting current funding requirements. I'm guessing this depends on who's funding your research and how much funding you have. Certainly in the US and in Europe, funders are fairly stringent about making sure that your funding has outputs. They're edging away now from mandating publications, because obviously what people would do is slice up their work into as smaller piece as possible and publish as much as possible. They are hedging away from that and hedging away from the emphasis on just publishing lots of papers in as high an impact journal as possible. But it's still a degree, some tyranny there on how that happens. Less emphasis as well on getting future funding. Generally, when you apply for funding, you will have a statement of your previous work, effectively a curriculum vitae or resume of your previous funding. It is good to have a strong publication record. It demonstrates your activity in the field. Again, there's somewhat less emphasis these days on just having lots and lots and lots of papers, but it's a challenging and controversial area. It's summing up somebody's career in a way that's meaningful and not just saying I've had 22 papers in high impact journals that had journal impact factors, but it's still there in the background. I am really pleased to see that more than half of you were looking to further your research mission and just take your kind of pure science and research forwards. That's fantastic. And I'm also pleased to see that a considerable number of people want to contribute to policy, because policy is how your research has a wider impact. So not just on yourselves, but on, why are we doing research? And this is important to us at Frontiers, because we're doing research for a reason. This is our mission, is to actually influence policy. We want people to use our research and make evidence-based decisions. So if you do have a policy around climate change, that should be based on research. And this has been important to where we are at the moment with at least our first steps to addressing climate change. But it was very important in COVID, for instance, in really driving the way that we responded to that. Perhaps not as well as we could have, particularly in the early days, but the successes around delivering effective vaccines in a massively condensed timescale is amazing. And that's been driven in part by openness. The entire COVID data set was made freely available. So, and that really did change things. And that was made available by special request. It wasn't just simply people publishing in open access journals. So hopefully there won't be a future pandemic, but when one does happen, there shouldn't need to be a special request. This should be something which is freely available from the get-go. And if you have an idea, then you should be able to access that research and deploy it in your own research to take things forwards. So thank you for that one. I'm going to skip now onto the next slide and start talking about what it is you should be looking for in a good open access journal. So firstly, when you're thinking about a journal, I'm going to take you through a few things here. I'm going to use Frontiers just as a benchmark. It's just not, shouldn't be taken as purely advertising for Frontiers, but I obviously think we have a good, strong open access presence. And I think that the fields, that the things that we do are exemplary for the field. So don't take this as an advert or product placement here, but I want to talk you through a couple of things here. And firstly is you should be able to access information about that journal. And it should be information you can readily understand and digest. And there's some key things that you should be looking for when you're looking at a journal. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is just editors. When you look at the editors of a journal, every journal should have editors. It should have a lead editor, an editor-in-chief, a chief editor, whatever terminology they use, and then a band of editors too. So there should be an editorial board, associate editors. It could be an advisory board too. But the key thing here is you should be able to recognize these people. They should be active in your field. The people at the top of the pile, so the chief editors, the editors-in-chief, they should be leaders in your field. You should recognize their names. You should certainly recognize their publications. You should see that whatever work they're doing aligns with the field itself. So if you're publishing a paper in oncology, then these should show a relevant expertise and reputation in oncology. Now, oncology is quite a broad field, so obviously it would depend on the scope of the journal, which I'll touch on in a moment. But it should be representative. They should be real people that you recognize, that if you click on them, you should be able to go through and see their published papers. You should recognize the institutions that they work for. There should be a wide range of people too. It should be international. If it's an international journal, it should have an editorial board that is also international. And when journals come to be indexed in Scopus, in the Clarivate indices, this is one of the key things those organizations look at. They want to see that a journal has that reputation and it has a broad international editorial board, which gives the journal its reputation. This is in effect the reputation of a journal. I can start a journal tomorrow. Frontiers in Ian's business intelligence studies. That's easy for me to do these days. It just requires a web presence, but it's not a good journal because there's nobody else aligned to it apart from myself, and you only have my reputation to go on. So having a wide editorial board gives you that key to a journal's reputation. So you should be looking for this when you publish open access, when you publish a subscription as well. But this information should be readily available. The next piece is scope. You don't have to read the scope here. This is just showing that there should be a statement about what the scope of a journal is. Why is that journal publishing? What is it hoping to achieve by what it published? What is it trying to publish? What subjects is it covering? These are important things that should be stated. When you're coming to submit your research, particularly if it's open access, and there's a question of payment of fees by a funder, by an APC, or asking for a waiver or a discount, you should be thinking about why and how you align with that scope, because otherwise you're just publishing in a very general journal and you won't get impact, because impact is tied to specificity. You need to publish your paper in the right place for it to be recognized. If you publish in the wrong place, it won't be seen. You won't get that impact. So it's not just publishing it in a quality journal, a journal that has an impact factor or something like that. It's publishing in the right journal. And this can be a challenge. More and more journals are being published, as you saw from the earlier graph. There's a lot more publication out there. New journals are being launched all the time. We launch new journals at Frontiers. Our competitors also launch new journals. The majority of new journals that are launched at the moment are gold open access. Like I say, this is the future, and more of this is happening. But it makes it more difficult to choose which journal is best for your research. There are tools that automate this. They're not perfect, actually, and I strongly recommend doing some research, having a look at what the journal scope is. Does it align with the research that you want to publish? Does it have a high ranking in that field? Does it have the editors that would support that, who would be able to look at your research and understand it? So there should always be this clear statement of mission and scope, and it should also tell you the type of content. So, is it original research? Is it case studies? Is it reviews? align those things. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. You're submitting to a journal. It will just get rejected immediately in the first steps of triage because it doesn't meet with what the journal's requirements are. Be indexed to get impact factors, those kinds of things. The people that make those decisions will look at the journal's scope, make sure that it has a clear scope, make sure it has a clear mission. So always check these things. Make sure you're in the right place and you're getting your content into the right place. Otherwise, you'll get a publication which has no impact because nobody will see it because it's gone into the wrong place. And then just to talk about some of the key facts, again, these should be clear. Journals, you should be looking at journals that are indexed in some way. Now, it's always been traditional to push to get into a journal impact factor journal. A lot of countries and organizations have pushed against this. There's a lot of debate around the journal impact factor. I'm not going to get into too much detail about that today. I've obviously had years of this when I worked for Clarivate, but it is a useful measure in some ways, but it's not the only measure. But by publishing in a journal that's in one of these key indices, gives it almost instant visibility because these are the key indexes which are being used across the, how can I put it, the research ecosystem. Now, there are lots of these. I'm not going to read them all out now, but I'm sure you're familiar with, for instance, PubMed and PubMed Central, probably Medline as well over at the National Institutes of Science. That's always a good place for journals to be recognized. Scopus in the Web of Science I've touched on. But you also want research to turn up in Google Scholar, for instance. Open access journals should be in the DOAJ. This is a list of open access journals that have passed a degree of, how can I put it, a degree of auditing. So there are solid open access journals that have passed the test to be officially a recognized journal. There are lots of other sources too. But any journal that you publish in should be in some of these sources. Even if it doesn't have an impact factor, it should still be recognized by some indices. This really gives that journal that aura of respectability. It's not just an aura, actually. It means they're respectable. To get into any of these, you have to pass a test, basically. The tests vary for each index, but you have to make sure, you have to demonstrate you have, that wide editorial board, that you have a firm scope, that you have policies, editorial policies. The quality of peer review as well, that has to be demonstrated to get into many of these indices. So be it indexed here, it means it's a good quality journal. It means it's a place that if you publish in, you're more likely to have your work recognized, you're more likely to get impact from your work. So make sure it's in there. A journal should also receive key things. A journal should have an ISSN. This is just a number that, it's a unique number for that journal. Any reputable journal will have this. It's not a quality check that goes into getting an ISSN, but it shows that the journal has due diligence, it's applied for this, it's indexed in major sources, in major library collections and elsewhere. Individual articles in that journal should receive identifiers too. This is a key part of what publishers do. A PMC ID just shows that content is being deposited into the PubMed Central repository. Every article could also have the DOI, which is the Digital Object Identifier. It's a simple code which links an article to its formal record. Everything that's published should have one of these. It means there's always a permanent link to your data. It also means the publisher has done the hard work of making sure that content can be found, can be indexed. These are basic expectations for any journal that wants to be indexed, but they should be basic expectations from yourselves as authors. You should expect any journal to provide these services. You should expect a journal to be indexed somewhere and have hit those key quality criteria to get indexed. When you come to submission, there should be a way to submit. It should be clear. Most journals these days will have some kind of internal submission, some kind of submission process. It's an online submission process. You should be able to submit from anywhere in the world. It should have clear guidance. So you probably heard the mention of the Scholar1 system that I used to work on. There's another system called Editorial Manager. There are some other systems out there. Frontiers has its own system. But they will let you submit. They will confirm that your article is correct for the journal. There's usually some auditing and triage at that, just to make sure that your paper is ready for that journal before it goes ahead and takes editor's time. Generally, you should get a rejection quickly if something is not up to scratch, if it's not aligned with the scope or anything else. You shouldn't be left for months before something happens. So it's important to check that the journal has a submission process. You should not be asked to pay at the point of submission generally. Payment in the open access world is typically at the point of acceptance and before publication. So anybody that asks for money up front basically is, well, I'd ask the question why they want the money at this point. Now, that does lead to an interesting question about open access. Effectively, anybody who's publishing open access is those accepted papers that go on to be published are actually paying for the peer review papers that don't get accepted. And that's just the way it works. So there is a subsidy by the authors who get published for everything else that comes in. But that's just, there's no other way really to do this in an equitable fashion. Also, there should be clear author guidelines expressing what the expectations are of authors, just to make sure that you have everything in the right format, you have all the information that's available. There were lots of guidelines, ethical procedures that often need to be signed off from, particularly if you're in the medical space. You will find that you need to make sure that all those statements are in place, that you've filled in all the checklists and everything else. But again, that should all be clear on a publisher's website. You shouldn't get for your submission, then find out later that you didn't do X, Y, and Z. That should be clear. Something else that I'm particularly passionate about is that journals have good, strong ethical policies. Now, we talked about gaming earlier in the process, gaming metrics. There are organizations which purport to get you published in a paper, these paper mills that exist in some parts of the world. I will say that publishers are getting quite good at spotting these. Not perfect, but there's a lot of effort that go into these. Any publishers should belong to organizations like COPE. This is an organization based around publishing ethics. They help a publisher and a journal align themselves around clear processes for managing ethical issues. And those ethical issues span a whole gamut of things that can happen, from simple plagiarism, and there are tools which check this these days, so it becomes quite easy to find those things, through to image manipulation. I talked about those citation cartels and stacking area where people cite themselves effectively or cite colleagues. All those things can be uncovered, and there need to be processes around that. Any journal should have a retraction policy, or a policy for adding corrections to published papers, or simply expressing concern if they feel that there is some controversy around a paper that's being published. Having retractions is not a bad thing. All major publishers have retracted papers. This is an essential correction to the publishing record. If something is found to be wrong, errant, or if there is some integrity issue, then publishers should retract this and they should retract papers. And there's been a lot of retraction activity, certainly during the COVID era. That's a good thing. But equally, when you're looking, you should make sure the publisher doesn't have a terrible reputation too. You should be retracting some things. You shouldn't be retracting lots and lots of things. And I will say, if any publisher claims not to have any retractions, that is just simply very unlikely. I can't believe there's any publisher or any journal in the world which has not published a paper whose integrity cannot be questioned. So there should be some retraction activity, I would say. But make sure that journals are aligned and do have clear statements of ethics. Because if you don't publish in a journal that has this, again, you won't get the recognition, you won't get the visibility. I talked about open access earlier. Again, there should be a clear statement of open access. Don't just assume because a paper is publishing content openly that it is in fact open access. You should get a CC BY license or something which is very similar. Most publishers now have orientated on the CC BY. It's an established mechanism for retaining copyright, but you should make sure that happens. Funders themselves may stipulate that your content has to be open now, so it has to be published under one of these licenses. So sometimes it's a case that you should be doing this to comply, not just to be publicly accessible. But make sure this is the case. Make sure there is a statement that you do get the CC BY license and you're not giving away your detail, your work effective to somebody else. There should be a pricing policy which is clear, and I'll touch on this in the next slide. So if you're publishing open access, somebody has to pay for it, whether that's an APC, whether that is through an institution, or whether it's something you need to get a waiver for. So certainly something that we do at Frontiers is that we do grant waivers and discounts. Because our mission is that all good science should be published, we take a fair proportion of our revenue and redistribute it back. So to enable people who can't afford it because they don't have funding, they don't have the resources, We don't want that to be the barrier to having their article, a good research being published. So we do have discounts. Other publishers have similar schemes as well, because we're trying to make, there is a cost to publishing, but we're trying to make sure the barriers are not stopping good research being published. So there should always be a statement on these too. You should be able to find out how you get your article into an open access journal if you can't afford to pay for it. And there should be a pathway to do that, because otherwise the publisher is just looking to get that APC revenue. That's not what we're about at Frontiers, and that shouldn't be what any good publisher is about, or any good journal. Quality we touched on here. I'm not going to get into huge detail about the quality, but this comes back to the first slide I showed where we had the journal webpage and all the clear steps about what would happen. There should be some statement about qualities. This ties into ethics too. So there should be clear procedures and workflows. There should be safeguards against things like conflicts of interest. You should be expected to state any conflicts of interest. So if you're being paid to do any of the research, you know, if you're publishing research about a new drug and you're working for that pharmaceutical company, those kinds of things, all those things should be stated and collected. It doesn't mean that you can't publish, but it should be stated and that information should be collected. And that doesn't stop at the point of having your article published. This then goes into that COPE side of things where, you know, if an issue is raised about your paper after it's been published, then there should be some activity that happens around that. And if necessary, that would be a correction, your opportunity to correct your work, to address those concerns. Or if it's something more critical, then that will move to being an expression of concern or potentially a retraction. So all these things should happen. I'm not going to dig into the details here, but you'll see the steps here that we take at Frontiers. That's making sure that we have the quality editorial board, that we assign the right people to that paper, that we assign the right reviewers to that paper. That at the end of the process, we make sure that the reviews are substantial, that there is an agreement amongst the reviewers and the editors that the work should go forward for publication. And then at the very end of the process, to make sure that we've made the right decision on a paper. We don't want to reject good papers. We want to make sure we accept the best papers. And of course, then checking against those conflicts of interest, particularly financial conflicts of interest, but there may be other conflicts of interest too. And those final steps where we want to make sure that anything which is published in our journals remains robust and sound and adds to the literature. And publishers should publish these kinds of metrics here, which shows how many submitted papers are accepted for those that go on to be published in the journal, but also how many are rejected. So at Frontiers, we reject 40% of the papers that are submitted to us. This will vary by journal, by subject area, and by publisher, but there should be papers that are rejected because they don't meet the standards that we anticipate. Partly, they may just be going to the wrong place. So this is an argument for making sure that you align yourself with the scope and mission of a journal, but also to make sure that they are good quality papers. They deserve being published in our journals. I'll talk a bit at the end of today's session about impact, but we want to make sure we get the best papers. So, but also we don't want to make sure that we don't reject papers which have a valuable contribution to science. So these metrics should be available from a publisher. They should be available from a journal. These are on the Frontiers webpage, for instance. I would expect the same of any publisher. There should be some statement to show that they're rejecting content, because this is your guide to quality. If somebody's publishing everything they receive and they're collecting the APCs for that, then you should ask yourself, is this a quality publisher? Is this a place where I want to put my article? Because again, if you put it into a poor quality publication, you won't get visibility, you won't get recognition, and you won't get impact. And then finally, fees. I mentioned before, these should be clearly stated and unambiguous. They should be within the norms of what you would expect for a open access journal. If somebody's offering to publish your article for $250, I would say that looks very dubious. If they're offering $12,000, then, well, maybe you want to get into nature, but that would be I think a strong fee for anyone. So make sure the fees are realistic. Typically they're around $2,500 to $3,000. If you pay them, obviously getting a waiver will mean you don't have to pay those. There should be a clear statement as to what those fees are, what they apply to, which journals they apply to. So these statements should be clear. You should know what the anticipated fees are, and you should again know what the discount and waiver policies are. I apologize if you can't read the details of this one. This is just showing the range of fees which are paid for gold open access journals and for hybrid publications. So you'll see here that there's a spread of fees. I also want to say that open access publishing is cost effective. So the money that we take from these APCs that goes into publishing platforms, all those quality and audit steps, does go into that. And it's somewhat cheaper than the estimates for subscription publishing, which you see in the black line there at the beginning. It's hard in some ways to work out what the cost of subscription publishing is, because a lot of it is hidden in library agreements and consortium agreements. So we can only make an estimation, but it is a cost-effective publishing mechanism. But you know, if a journalist fees are an outlier compared to what you see on screen here, then you should have questions about how legitimate that is. Anybody that's taking money from you as an author should be able to demonstrate that money is being spent in an effective fashion. They should be able to demonstrate their reputation, and they should be able to demonstrate that they will get you impact. And it should all come together with a clear web presence, gives you the key metrics for that journal. So you see here, this is one of our journals, Frontiers in Neuroscience. You'll see it has an impact factor, has a site score. I'll touch on metrics in a moment. It's received lots of citations. And all these things are clearly itemized that I talked about earlier. So you can see a good solid presence, a journal that will get you impact because the journal itself has impact. It's a venue that you want to publish in. So I'm going to step into poll 4 now. We're actually running quite quickly on time. So what are you looking for in a journal? So I'm always interested to see whether or not it's one of those metrics, whether or not you're invested in its ethical. And you can click up to 3 of these actually. It won't just be one of these things, but these should be the leading 3 things that guide your selection. I haven't touched on marketing actually, but marketing is a key thing too, because again, this aids in visibility. We want to make sure that your journal is visible. Otherwise, again, you won't get cited and impact. So that's social media campaigns and everything else. A strong reputation. This might not be a journal impact factor, but it's a journal that you recognize and your colleagues recognize. And this is often the case for regional journals, which maybe don't have the international scope, but are still very important in your regions. Knowing the editors, knowing how quickly you'll get published, because you don't want to wait 6 months for that to happen. And then just to pivot on reputation, is it a journal that has an international scope because you want to get that wider visibility? So if we have the results now, could we just take a quick look at those? Okay, there you go. So journal impact factor is still pretty important. It is a signifier of a high quality journal. I can't take that away. These are journals which have passed the most stringent tests effectively. They're usually established journals at the top of their fields. It's very hard for new journals to get an impact factor. This is the challenge that we certainly have at Frontiers, and every publisher has it, because those standards are extremely strict. So it is a good guide. I won't say the absolute number is critical, but having a journal impact factor means it's passed a lot of standards. I will say that I'm a little bit disappointed that only 20% of you are looking at a strong ethical guidelines and stances. You should look for that because it is important. If you publish in the wrong place, you won't get that impact. Marketing is around the same level. This is something that you don't necessarily see a publisher doing, and they can't market everything. There's too many papers to do every single one, but they should have you should be able to see them on social media promoting papers, you know, Twitter or places like that. You should be able to see some activity from a publisher. I'm pleased to see reputation is very high. That's good. Nobody talked about editors that they know. In some ways, that's a good thing because this is how some of these citation cartels come about. What's known as coercive citation, where editors encourage you to cite their journal in exchange for acceptance. You should recognize the editors, but no, it's good to see that it's not just a reliance on that network. Speed of review and publication is always important. You don't want your work to languish for a long period of time. When it finally gets published, it's no longer topical, which means it doesn't get cited, doesn't get the impact that you want. And finally, international scope is important. Again, this does drive impact. If you can get into an international journal, you're more likely to see your work cited. So if we could move on now, we'll talk about the final section, which is just bringing this together and using open access to improve the impact of your research. And then we'll take some questions at the end. So just let me dive into this one at the moment. So using open access to improve the impact of your research. And firstly, just measuring your impact. So one final poll, that's actually might be the penultimate poll. So I just want to know how you contributed to journals in the past now. So just tick the roles. Sorry. just tick the ones that you participated in. We'll do this one quite quickly, so click as fast as you can. It's a challenge. And if we have answers, if we just switch to the answers. Oh, it's good to see that the majority of you have actually contributed before, and a lot of authoring, but also as reviewers, and as editorial board and academic editors. That's good to see, actually, because there is an opposite side to authorship, and that is participation in the journal. You'll get more from the process if you do participate. I appreciate there's lots of arguments about reviewers being paid and those kinds of things, but certainly when I reviewed, and I still do occasionally, I view it as something which is essential to being part of that research ecosystem. And, you know, I expect people to review my papers, so I should pay that back in kind. So if we could close the poll now. I want to talk about just measures of impact quite quickly here. So there is a process here. Content gets viewed first. Hopefully that content gets downloaded for use, for citation later. So we always see this pattern here. This is something that we see at Frontiers, but all publishers see, where there's initial views turn into downloads, and some people download some of this content into their reference manager tools. You may use some of those tools, EndNote, Mount Mendeley, those kinds of things. And then later it gets used. There's always a lag between things getting cited because people have to take that in, they have to write their own papers. They have to get those papers published as well. So you always see this pattern here. All these three things are important to getting impact. So you want to get views, you want to get download, and you want to get ultimately citations. I'm not going to talk about metrics in any detail. There are a lot of metrics here. We touched on them earlier in the process. Journal impact factor is journal level. It's contextual. You should not cite journal impact factors outside of their fields. Comparing something in a social sciences field with a biomedical field or a chemical field it's misleading and not correct. Journal impact factors are there to 3 decimal places. Next year, that's moving to 1 decimal place. There are some changes happening at Clarivate. It's a good measure, but it shouldn't be overinterpreted. It's not the only measure. There's a link here to a handy page from Elsevier, which summarizes the different metrics. So site score is a metric from Elsevier. Clarivate have another indicator called the Journal Citation Indicator, which is akin to site score. There's a journal ranking. There's also some more complicated metrics. This is not a list of every metric that's out there, but journals should have these metrics. There's also the H-index, which is the more global productivity and impact metric. You can get that from many sources. All these things are important. A quality journal will have these things, it will quote these things, and it will be representative for where it is pitched in its field. Look for these things. It shouldn't have them all maybe, but it should at least have some of these. Again, it's a measure of quality. There's also altmetrics and social metrics. Altmetrics has made a splash in recent years. Again, it just shows the wider perception of your paper. These are impact. Any journal should really have some form of altmetric. It ties into their social media marketing policies. You want journals to market your research or market some research. Have a profile in social media. It's not just about getting cited, it's about getting seen. And being open access means there's no limits as to who can see your article, but eyes have to be directed to the right place. If they're not looking at your article, then you're not going to get any impact. So it needs to be in a journal which promotes it, and it needs to be an article which is occasionally promoted too. And then it needs to get cited in blogs and social media, Facebook, Twitter, the usual places, but also mentioned in the main media too. If you have a groundbreaking piece of research, you want to make sure that is communicated to media sources and get it out there. Most big publishers will isolate some of this content and make sure that it does get a wider mention. So it shouldn't just be closed into the sort of the scientific and research ecosystem. There is potential for some articles to get out there into the mainstream media, the press, and places like that. So a good journal should give you metrics on these too. So you should have the alt metrics, you should have the metrics for the journal itself. But it should also give you the views and downloads for your paper too. So you should be able to log in at any point and be able to see that something is happening to your paper. The people are looking at it and the people are taking that and likely to reuse it in the future. And just to demonstrate where frontiers is in the mix, you'll see there that all the publishers have impact. This graph has come out slightly strangely here, but this is just showing the ranking on the y-axis, so how impactful a journal is. The size of the circle there is just the output from that publisher. And you'll see here that Frontiers, MDPI, Gold Open Access journals publish as strongly as their peers, their subscription peers, and they have the same impact, if not better. And if I skip to the next slide, you'll see here, this is just a slight plug for Frontiers, but we do feel we are the leading open access, Gold Open Access journal. And you'll see here that our impact actually is higher than many of our competitors. And the only two organizations above Frontiers are very specialist chemical publishers. So we're the highest ranking multidisciplinary publisher, I would say, certainly above most of our peers. This is not just about Frontiers. You'll see there the Public Library of Science, MDPI, other Gold Open Access publishers are having significant impact. So, you know, my argument here is that by publishing open access, you're not detracting from your quality. So we're the same, if not better, and I'm going to say better at this point. So you want to make a splash with your research. So this will be my final slide before we just have a minute or two for questions. And this is just bringing this all together. So you've written your paper, you'll see that at the very bottom of this, what I call a virtuous circle. You want to make sure that you find a good journal. It has a strong audience. It is the journal that you want to publish in. It has recognition. It touches on all the things I mentioned earlier. It should be a journal which is indexed in some format, whether that's a journal impact factor or similar, but it should be in those places like Medline, the Clarivate indices, Scopus, and you know, there should be some recording and auditing of views, downloads, and citations. So you found the right journal. It has a strong enough impact to really represent your work. You get published, but then you want to make sure that you keep publishing. You want to make sure you grow your network of collaborators, make sure they're international, if that's reasonable for you, because then you're getting more and more eyes on your research, you're putting it into more of an international concept, and then you can keep publishing. That will help you get more collaborators. It will help you get back into those journals. So the more publications that you have, the better quality of those publications that you have, the more likely they're going to be successful and get into the higher impact publications. And it all has to be high quality too. And this does depend on the publisher and choosing the right publisher. Good quality publications tend to attract more interest. So by publishing in the right place, the right journals with the right contributors and having excellent quality, lets you build your profile, lets you keep going and keep going. So this kind of builds a circle. It's hard to get into this circle, but once you're in this circle, it really is the most beneficial place to sort of get your impact effectively. And just a final word on why to choose open. Just to summarize what I talked about before, there's no paywall. We still have those high quality publication standards. You retain a copyright on your work. You can do what you want with it. Established publishers will showcase your research, will do those marketing, and that discovery drives the visibility, and visibility gets you seen. So by being open, we give you everything that you need. So one final poll as we just have a few minutes. If we do this one quickly, just so we have a minute or two for questions at the end, that would be fantastic. As soon as we have enough answers, could we just take a look? Do we have the results? Views and downloads not huge. Citations, quite obviously. Being able to be outfound, that's that visibility piece is fantastic. And also the type of citations is also fantastic. So you don't just be cited by anyone. If you can be cited by key opinion leaders in your field, then that's even better. And the ability to freely distribute and share, it is important. People did this before, to be honest. They've often ignored those copyright restrictions, but just having the openness to be able to do things is fantastic. So do we have 2 or 3 minutes for questions at this point? So I'm open to answer as many as possible. I will just give you my details as well if there are questions after this session. But I hope it's been informative. So any major questions?
Yeah, thanks, Ian, for this wonderful presentation. I will just quickly, there are 2 minutes, so we can quickly take up 1 or 2 questions. So the first question that I will like to ask from the Q&A session is that high APC to publish in open access put researchers from countries like India at a disadvantage. So we are neither considered for the waiver meant for LMICs, neither do we have the economic equity with the global north. So, and this is not just India. I mean, our neighboring South Asian countries also in another couple of years will be exactly the same situation where India is now. So how can this disparity and systemic bias can be addressed? And what specifically Frontiers does to address these inequalities?
At Frontiers, we offer a significant proportion of discounts and waivers. So anybody that can't pay, that's not a restriction on publication. You won't be asked to pay until you come to the point of publication. If you say at that point that you cannot afford it, you do not have the funds to do so, we will move forwards with publication. So if it's a high quality article that we want to publish, we feel it favours our mission at Frontiers, we will not take money from you. You are effectively being subsidised by the global north, which I think is the correct way for it to happen. So those people that can pay are asked to pay. Those people that can't pay are not asked to pay. That should not restrict you from publishing in a Frontiers journal. And I would say that many of the publishers have a very similar policy. It's not perfect, but payment should not be the restriction on getting good work published.
Maybe one final question and then we will leave. So if we want open science to be sustainable and virtuous, do reviewers need to get paid for their time while more open access journals appear?
My personal opinion is no, and I say this having been a reviewer on many papers over the years. I think the contribution of reviewers is well, it's obviously vital, but it is part of that scientific ecosystem. If I want to be able to publish papers, then I need people to review my papers, so my payback is to review their papers. There is an argument, obviously, that people are donating their time freely, and publishers then are taking money out of that system. As an open access publisher, if we were to pay reviewers, the infrastructure to do so, the cost of doing so would require us to raise our fees, basically. So yes, we can do it, but the money needs to come from somewhere to do that one. We don't make a huge profits on what we publish, and most of that money goes back into our infrastructure, building our teams, all that peer review auditing and everything else. So yes, we could pay reviewers, but the money still needs to come from somewhere. And it's not my view that it's the correct way forwards, but I know there are strong opinions on this.
Thanks a lot, Jan. I think because we are already 1 minute ahead of the time, some people have raised hand, but what we will do is that we will ask them to write the question and send it to you. If you think that there is some interesting question, you can get back to us.
I would, yeah, any questions, send them to me and I will share them with yourselves as well, so you can redistribute it more widely if you choose to.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Jan, for your time and showing us how our open access publishers work, because there are a lot of let's say a lot of apprehension in the region because of various reasons. So we try to make our program inclusive so that people, it's their choice. They should learn and then they should choose where they want to publish. So thanks a lot, and also thanks a lot for enlightening us how to choose a good publisher, right, to publish, because there's a lot of debate on predatory publishing in India and this region that researchers fall prey to it. So I hope that all our participants have gotten good answer of it, that how they should choose a journal. So thanks a lot, Jan. Thank you for coming today. And
thank you for inviting me.
Frontiers as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So thanks a lot, everyone. We'll take a short 10 minutes break, and we should come back by 3:40 to within 3:45 sharp. We will start our next session, which is a flash talk. So we would expect the participant to join by 3:40 to 3:42, because we will start our next session sharp at 45. Thank you. Thank you all.
Okay, so welcome to the second day of Flash Talks. I'm Gautam Sharma and I'll be moderating this session. So today we will be having 4 presentations from the participants, and just want to repeat the rules with all the speakers. We'll have 8 to 10 minutes per participant, and we request all the speakers to please finish their presentation within the stipulated time. I'll give a reminder to each participant after 8 minutes, and you are requested to conclude in the next 2 minutes after that reminder. So we'll start with Nidhi Sherawat today from Development Alternatives. Her paper was scheduled for yesterday, but we could not do it because of some technical glitch. So I'll now invite Nidhi Sherawat, and she'll be presenting her ongoing study on integrated water resources assessment of Udaipur district, co-authored with Tanya Isar and Geetika Goswami. Over to you, Nidhi.
Yes, thank you so much, Gautam. I would just like to know if my screen is visible to all of you.
Yeah, it's visible. You can put it in the presentation mode.
Yes, I'm just doing that. Yes, I hope the full screen is visible now.
Yes.
Yes. So I would greet all the participants and would like to thank DST-CPR team for giving us this opportunity to showcase our ongoing work in Udaipur in collaboration with the Danish Embassy. So the project that is ongoing is on citizen science, and it's themed on the integrated water resource management of Udaipur districts. So the objective of this project are we are like desiring to develop a sustainable integrated water resource management model in the Udaipur district, and under which the sub themes that will be covered will be trying to understand and map the hydrology of the entire IR river system, which is the main river system of the Udaipur district. And also a data and decision support system will be established so that the data can be easily stored and analyzed statistically, whichever data will be collected. So in the further coming slide, I'll be describing which data we are collecting under this integrated water resource assessment model. And also the theme would be, the motive of this theme would be to let the citizens know about the water quality of the district to which they belong. And also, as everybody knows, Udaipur is a city of lakes. So we are installing a smart sensor network in every lake to monitor the water level and water quality of those particular lakes. And this data will be regularly updated on a website which is being developed in collaboration with the Danish Embassy. And one sociological aspect of the project is to involve citizens and every level stakeholders, from students to farmers to activists to other socially and politically active people, so that they can take part in the development and promotion of sustainable water management of their district. And also the ultimate aim would be to establish a strong research partnership in natural resource management between India and Denmark. So these are the project partners. The University of Copenhagen, Denmark, and Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland, and DHI, Water and Environment Private Limited, India, and Vidya Bhavan Polytechnic, that is a local partner based in Udaipur only, and Development Alternatives. And the associate strategic partners are Danish Embassy and Aarhus City Municipality Corporation. So this is for a brief introduction. This is a IR river basin. So it covers 4 districts of Rajasthan and 1 district of MP. Udaipur, Chittorgarh, Rajsamand, and Bhilwara are the district of Rajasthan that comes under the IR river basin, and Neemuch is the district of Madhya Pradesh that comes under the IR river basin. So this is the basic methodology of citizen science. So the motive of this engagement is to demystify science, so that we want that the engagement of citizens should be such like that they are not feared of science. They should take active involvement in the scientific activities, particularly in the field of water resource management, because water is a field which is most affected by climate change activities, and Udaipur being a tourist city, water plays a mainstream role in the natural resource management of this particular city. So the citizen science is basically themed under the scientific work that will be undertaken by the citizens of Udaipur. The citizens will comprise of farmers, students, and various activists. So they will gather scientific data on different themes of water management, and then they will share with the scientific personals or policymakers. So the methodology of citizen science goes like this. First, we identify institutions for the citizen science network. So these institutions are basically on the Ayad River basins, because the Ayad River almost covers the entire stretch of Udaipur district. And then active engagement was carried out with these schools through preliminary workshop on water quality testing, on importance of rainwater harvesting. And then there was a strong formation of citizen science network. And after forming the citizen science network, from each institutions, like a group of water saviors were selected who will perform different tasks under the water resource management model. And then these students or group of people were trained on different themes like rainfall measurement, water quality testing the ecological health of water bodies in Udaipur. And then more students were brought under this citizen science umbrella through the participatory approach, and after consulting with the teachers or the school or the institution staff. And then to digitize the data collected by the students or the people, or specifically we can say citizens, we have made this MyWell application. So whichever data is collected, like rainfall measurement data, water quality data, this data will be fed in the MyWell application so that it is universally accessible. And this will be done after proper authentication from the other departments like groundwater department and all. And this will be followed by continuous engagement with students and citizens through by conducting follow-up visits on themes like water quality testing or rainfall measurement or community engagement, or like organizing water cafes and everything. And then this final purpose of this engagement is to create a robust set of data about the water resources of Udaipur city. So these are the four different themes where citizens can and are contributing in sustainable water management of Udaipur city. So under rainfall measurement, the training was imparted on how to measure rainfall and and also a behavioral change and capacity building sessions were organized about the importance of rainwater harvesting. And then there is a different theme of water quality testing, in which we have our DA Tara team has their Jal Tara kits, which test 14 parameters of water quality. So these were distributed to the institutions selected in the first phase of the training. And then to observe the fluctuations in the water level and their quality, there is a theme called well monitoring, in which students will be trained to how to monitor the depth of the well, the change in the fluctuation of the fluctuation in the water level of the well. So students will be trained and they will carry out this well monitoring activity. And then monitoring ecological health of surface water body, a group of students or citizens will be made, and they will collectively through this Jal Tara kits, or qualitatively and quantitatively also, they will monitor this ecological health of all the lakes of Udaipur. And together this will contribute to a integrated water resource assessment, a citizens learning kit. So a module is being prepared on all these themes, that how the citizens should carry out these activities, and how it is beneficial for not in the specifically in the context of Udaipur, but in the context of other cities also. So this citizens learning kit will be contextualized according to different cities, and it will help as a learning tool for citizens on how they can manage water resources of their own city.
2 minutes more.
Yes, sir. So I'll quickly wrap up. So the citizen science interventions has involved like 10 plus institutions till now of Udaipur. So this includes private public schools, NGOs and state government officials, and 70 plus citizens have been actively trained on water quality testing, well monitoring and rainfall measurement. And the citizens that have been reached out in Udaipur are 500 plus. So these are some glimpses of the water quality testing camps being organized and the rainfall measurement trainings being given in the school premises itself. Yes, so there were some observation, though the data set is not that robust, but there are some observations that have been recorded by students after analyzing their own data. So there is, in the monsoon season, there was some fecal pollution found in the water quality of Udaipur, and also the dissolved oxygen value of surface, most of the surface water bodies of Udaipur is quite alarming. And yes, so the upcoming challenges, there are three major challenges in this citizen science project. First is the validation of data that citizens are collecting, and how to make, second one will be how to make this program or this project sustainable. That will be of course done by institutionalizing these programs, but this will be in a last phase, that how to make this sustainable and how to create a block level or village level water kind of, will be creating some water cafes or water committees which will be helping in institutionalizing these programs. And also continuous active engagement of citizens is also a big task, but regular follow-ups are being conducted, and a report establishment session is being organized continuously, so that citizens are more and more active in participating and they want to involve by themselves in activities like these. So there are some way forwards. First will be the data integration with the Marvi app, and the integration of this everything, the rainfall measurement, water quality testing with the data set that is present for the water resource management of Udaipur district. And also citizens can then engage themselves with the environmental issues such as biodiversity, land, climate change, etc. So these are the basic themes of the citizen science project. Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Nidhi. That's really an interesting study. We have a question for you. I request you if you would like to answer that. It's in the Q&A box. Till then, I would like to invite the next participant. The next participant is Obaya Mogire from Southeastern Kenya University. And the title of his talk is Open Science Framework for SDGs. And it's co-authored with Joseph Wafula and Wangi Waweru. Over to you, Obaya. Yeah, Nidhi, if you can stop sharing your screen. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Can you see the screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, the Open Science South Asia Network, to showcase open data policy model that can be able to address the grand global challenges that is a sustainable development goal. As you have heard, my name is Mogire. I'm a lecturer at Southeastern Kenya University, and welcome. We are called to set data free. However painful it is, we have to set data free. For open science require this. We require this data, we require this scientific research data from governments, from public, from private, for us to be able to use it to address the grand global challenges towards sustainable development. And that is why the United Nations in the Vision 2030 Dream set an ambitious agenda envisaging poverty eradication, systematic tackling of the climate change, as well as building peaceful, resilient and equitable, as well as inclusive societies. And this emphasizes open science by releasing data and using that data to address the societal challenges. The African Union in the same year, 2015, came up with the African Dream of 2063. And an African dream is a dream that envisions a peaceful, prosperous, and integrated continent, because the African Union discovered that we either unite or collectively perish, as no one single country or a region that can be an island of prosperity in an ocean of poverty, insecurity, and development. Therefore, we are saying that we have to unite. It calls for global collaborations, leveraging on technologies to be able to address the giant that is the challenges we are facing. This requires very systematic as well as sustained open science or research science to be able to arrive at data-driven decisions. And therefore, our big data has various features in terms of the volume, varieties, veracity, veracity, the value, validity of our data, variability of our data, the venue where we are getting this data from, the vocabulary that's being used, and the fakeness require that this big data must be open and must have the FAIR principles. This data must be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable to that effect. And therefore, moving from production of data to the impact or the value chain of open science require that we now move from, after we collect, we publish, we need to uptake, and then we are able to measure the impact this data is having in our society. But what are the problems of this open science? We are experiencing various challenges in the open data ecosystem in terms of weak legislation in many countries, especially in African countries. There is also lack of policies in place. You realize that many countries ventured into open data movement without adequate legislation, without adequate policies. And therefore, majority of open data movement, open science, is relying on political goodwill. And once the political goodwill of the countries subsides, then of course that will die. Therefore, there is need for us to have adequate legislation, adequate policies in open science ecosystems, and not relying on the political goodwill, as whenever this one changes, of course, that will die. We are saying that open data is not yet entrenched in the law and the policy frameworks. And very few open data policies are under development in many countries. There are also issues to do with the barriers. And of course, some of these barriers include legal barriers that must be addressed in terms of an area under which licenses to data set can be reused. There are also political challenges that I've mentioned in terms of politicians do not understand the complexities of open science, because we are saying that open science must be inclusive, not only governments, but the public, researchers, everybody should be on board. And therefore there must be a political goodwill to release this data to be able to address the grand global challenges. We also have impediments that include the social challenges. We have also economical challenges, difficulty to make money within the open data. Or we are saying that data that used to be sold should not become available for free. And therefore, we are saying that we must understand the economical challenges that surround the concept of open science in terms of funding, and probably people are selling this data for economical gain. We are also saying that there must be institutional changes in terms of how we deal with open science, as well as operational and the technical challenges surrounding open science must be equally addressed for us to be able to address the global challenges. Therefore, open science calls for inclusivity. All nations, including the marginalized, the digital divide, both official and other data must be on board. There should be no silos, no data blind spots, and we should not leave anyone behind. Everyone must join the movement for us to be able to address the challenges. Data producers, data analysts, technology applications and communications, the think tank in the academia, development of policy entrepreneurs, the media, government, ministries and sectors, citizens and the community. All these people must be involved in this open science ecosystem. Therefore, the governance is very, very important in terms of leadership, in terms of strategic planning, the management and control of open science policies, data management, as well as data uses. There need to have a proper organizational structure in terms of the human resource, the partnership, the culture, the legal framework, all these things, the telecos, the ICT utilities require skilled users. There is need to have funders, publishers, data distributors, as well as, standard supports must be in place, including the ICT architecture in terms of the information systems and data delivery. Data handling and distribution must be discussed. Identity, the DOI, metadata and contextual documentation, as well as repositories, all these are multi-layered network framework architecture that should be entrenched in open data science. The open data or open science bedrocks require securing the political commitment of countries is very, very important, as I've mentioned. Without the political commitment, we cannot be able to move on. Financial sustainability is very, very important in terms of open science. What is this grand global challenge? We have to build capacities as well as also skills, to people are involved in the open science ecosystem. Building partnership and synergies is required, as well as also building the evidence, embedding data evolution in Africa and the rest of the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vaya, for those experiences from Africa. And there are two questions for you in the Q&A box. Please see if you would like to answer them. Till then, we'll move to the final participant. I request you to please stop sharing your slide. So,
yes, let me. One has asked Roland that is there much incentives for using open science?
Yeah,
and the reproducible science.
Yeah, I would request
promotion.
if you could type in that answer. Till then, we'll have the presentation from our next participant, since we are short.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vaya. So,
welcome.
I don't see we are having Ramnath here, so we'll move to the final participant, Janvi Sharma, independent policy researcher, and she'll be presenting on extension of citizen science model for environment management measures in lieu of development activity, case of Namma Metro. Over to you, Janvi. Please put your slides in the presentation mode.
Hi, thanks for it's a pleasure to be part of this conference. I've not been able to attend many of the sessions, but it's good to sure. Hi, is it visible now? I hope it is visible.
Internet is not good from your side, I think. Your voice is breaking, and the slides are also not in the presentation mode.
I hope the slides are visible now. Presentation mode.
Not yet. Can you please try it once again by sharing it again? You may have to unshare and share it again.
I have shared it in the presentation. I
Okay, please go ahead.
hope it is.
We can't hear. Your voice is breaking.
Janvi, we are not able to hear you.
Yeah. So it's this platform here.
Okay, I think she's disconnected. We'll wait for her to join again.
In the meantime, the previous participant can maybe answer the question if he's around. Mobire.
Yeah, Obaya,
Hmm.
if you'd like to take
Yes,
a,
yes.
yeah, please.
You are saying I respond to the question.
Yeah. The question was that I think you have already answered that, but it would be
But
good.
let me just expound
Yeah, please.
asked whether there is incentives around this open science. I want to say that there is no much incentives because sometimes the funders of this research always gives conditions. There is tied strings that once research is carried out, data has been collected, probably they will go with this kind of data. And therefore, you realize that there is a need to change our open science ecosystems in terms of the policies that can be able to incentivize this whole story of open science. So lack of adequate funds and the policies are the impediments, to this open science in terms of these incentives. You realize, for example, at the onset of COVID, it has taken longer than expected to address COVID challenges because initially, you had issues of legal issues in terms of these patents, and all those kind of things is really what is actually making this open science not to make much progress. And even when we had the outbreak of Ebola in 2016, if there was, of course, there was a lot of research that was carried out to understand, the pandemic of Ebola. And when that was done, there are so many countries that came to Africa for this. And once that was done, everybody disappeared, went back to their country with the data. And therefore, that's why we are saying that we must have a policy around this open science on how you are able to reward, how you are able to give incentives to people who are involved in this research, and not only through applications for that matter. Yes, back to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Boya, for that answer. I think we have Janvi back again with us.
I don't see her, Gautam.
Yeah, she joined as an attendee. I just promoted her to a panelist.
Okay.
But it disconnected again. In the meantime, if any of from the
No,
attendees or panelists have any question.
Gautam, again, she joined us.
Okay.
She joined as panelist now.
Okay, Janvi, can you unmute yourself?
Yes. Hi, Gautam. I hope I'm audible. Shall I share my screen? I think there was some network issue back then.
Yeah, we understand. We have 15 minutes. Please try to share your slides and please carry on with your
Yes,
presentation.
absolutely. Absolutely.
You'll have 10 minutes. After that, we'll have a floor open for any questions.
Sure. So it was good to attend the presentation from Nidhi, and I got to know a little bit about citizen science platform as to how it works and how it is how it can be used for citizen science writing models for activities related to say water or even monitoring fisheries activities or even something else.
Excuse me, the sound is so poor.
For ecological purposes where we collect data on presence of birds. Yeah, hello.
It's still a lot of
am I,
disturbance, but please carry on.
Is there some noise? Or am I not? Okay, sure. So basically, I wanted to apply this, or I wanted to vouch this idea onto whether we can use module for for using environment or management activities when we take.
We can't hear you, Janvi.
I think we lost her again.
She's here.
The area. But I hope I'm clear. Is it the network is breaking a bit? Yeah. Okay. So this is where we're using selecting species, selecting an area, or engaging people, or for replying to all of these concerns and cases. It would make the process much more easier and smooth rather than having number of multiple review wherein it becomes a lot of burden for people or organizations such as the BMRCA in this case. So I was thinking of it as more of a solution term, and I would request some idea like on whether or not it is something which can be done, which is not going against democratization of the process wherein people do apply or people ask for access or information, but at the same time it rather cuts down the information gap on what the activities are to be undertaken and what are being undertaken. So there is this information is publicly available, and yeah, and this is due to the network thing. I do not want to extend it too long, but I would request some feedback. This is just what I was trying to present, and as part of the abstract as submitted and as part of this conversation today. Gautam, I over to you.
Thank you, John. I think there was a lot of disturbance from your side, so we could not really particularly hear it.
Yeah, there was some technical issues, but we do get an idea that it's an ongoing study of hers and she is in the process of completion. But we'll have 5 minutes for any question and answers. If attendees or panelists have any questions, otherwise we'll wrap up the session and get ready for the next one, the final session of the day.
Do we have any question?
Yeah, please. Do you have any question?
No, I'm asking if there's anybody who has a question.
No. Your present.
I wanted to ask a question about that. what is the situation of open science overall in Africa? If you can quickly summarize that, maybe in 5 minutes or so.
Thank you so much. When we look at the open science landscape in Africa, we discover that we are making progress, but we are not yet there. Reason being is that we have a lot of challenges, especially in the funding, especially in our research, tank systems, like even in universities. And again, not all countries have embraced this concept of open data. Based on the political temperatures or the political goodwill of a given country, we realized that open science could be an hindrance. And again, we also realized that some of the channels are very expensive in terms of publications. That, of course, hinders, most researchers from getting to these high impact channels because of the funding issues. Again, we are saying. So you realize that we are very good research, but when it comes to publications, we are not able to meet the needs, the financial requirements, because these channels are very expensive or they are charged very high in terms of the publication fee. So the situation on the ground is that, yes, we are making progress, but a lot needs to be done in terms of policy, legislation, as well as also funding, so that we can be able to propel open science to another level, to be able to address, to use these, research output for informed decision making towards addressing the grand global challenge as envisaged in Vision 2030 agenda.
Thank you, Obaya, for giving us some perspective on the African side. Thank you. So as Gautam already had mentioned, we will soon move to our the final talk of the day by Professor Julian Richard, which will start at sharp 4:30. In the meantime, good afternoon, everyone. So we will now move towards our final talk for today's, the day 2 of OSSAN on 2022. So far, we in this already 3 sessions we already have completed, where we have discussed various issues of open science. We touched extensively upon the open access, because that's obviously globally a much debated topic. But then another topic which has been coming up more frequently right now is open research, open data or open research data. This is very important in the academic ecosystem. What we saw in the traditional publishing model, that data usually comes in an article or along with that in the supporting information file. These articles are usually behind a paywall, but supporting information file usually are open for anyone to use. But the formats are not user-friendly and the data obviously are not extensive. Many a time you need even access to raw data, which obviously is not available. So it hampers the data-driven innovation. So in this today's world where we talk so much about data science, AI, definitely we need much more access to data. We lose a lot of opportunity of reusing data because it's either not available or it's not available in proper format. So today we have Professor Julian Richards, and he will talk about the importance of open data in archaeology for preservation and reuse. He will give us a brief introduction to the digital repositories and e-infrastructure in Europe. A little introduction to Professor Julian Richard. So Julian Richard is Professor of Archaeology at the University of York, UK. He is founding director of the Archaeology Data Service and the e-journal Internet Archaeology, both established in 1996, 2 years before Google was launched. His direct involvement in archaeological computing began in 1980, when he started his PhD research studying pre-Christian burial rites in England using the computing power of an ICL mainframe. and an early Z80 microcomputer. In 1985, he co-authored the first textbook in archaeological computing for Cambridge University Press, and has subsequently written numerous papers and edited a number of books on applications of information technology in archaeology. He's currently deputy coordinator for the European ARIA DNE infrastructure for archaeology research and action chair for the cost action SEADDA, saving European archaeology from the digital dark age. Over to you, Professor Richard.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Yes, as you say, I'm going to be focusing on archaeology, but as a case study really of the importance of providing open access to data. And yes, I hope my presentation complements that on open access publication that Ian Potter gave earlier in today's conference session. I'll start by giving you a bit of background before I move on to the archaeology specific information. And one of the key events in the move towards open data is the Open Data Charter, which was agreed by the G8 nations in a summit held in 2013. And the vision behind the Charter was to open up a new era in which people can use open data to generate insights, ideas, and services to create a better world for all. And there were 5 key principles of the Charter. The first was that data should be open by default, that there had to be a good reason to keep data secret. Secondly, that by making data open, we should increase both its quality, but also emphasis on quantity and big data, and make it available particularly for reuse. Thirdly, that it should be made available in a format so that it was usable by all. And there were 2 sort of underlying aims really behind these principles. First, that by making data open, we should be able to improve governance by giving people access to data and information, but also that by making data freely available, it should support and stimulate innovation. And so in my own discipline, for example, in the heritage area, that it might be useful within the creative arts and cultural industries. So I'm just going to give a few statistics which really complement the sort of background information that Ian Potter gave earlier with regard to open access publications. And this is information from a paper published in Nature in 2013, so quite dated now. But even then, it was demonstrated that open data get more use. So scientists who share their data get more citations, and the authors examine the citations of over 10,000 papers. In this case, focused on gene expression, published between 2000 and 2009. And they found even then that for where the data were freely available, those papers received 9% more citations. And they also demonstrated that reuse and citations of open data continue to rise for 6 years after publication. And that's obviously specific to this discipline where maybe data moves on quite rapidly. But they emphasize that early career researchers have a good reason to share their data, and to quote, it will increase the impact of their research, and that's good for their citation statistics and visibility. But they noted that it was essential that researchers should store their data in well-known and easily accessible repositories. And another paper from Nature focused on the importance of sharing data for reproducibility. So not just the reuse of data, but to support claims made in publications and to provide the evidence to back those up. And increasingly, publishers are now requiring data, underlying data, to be made available, and funders also. So the National Science Foundation in the United States, this report said that they should support data repositories for long-term archiving and preservation of digital artifacts that support claims made in the scholarly-based record based on NSF-funded research. And that's a pattern now sort of mirrored by most funders. And another key moment in the move towards open data was the proposal of the FAIR principles, now well known and become somewhat cliched, but a bit of a buzzword in all grant applications, but nonetheless important. First promulgated at a workshop held in Leiden in the Netherlands in 2014, and then endorsed by the G7 science ministers in Turin in September 2017. And apologies if you're already familiar with these, but the FAIR principles stand for making your data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I won't go into the details of what each of those means in practice, but I'll provide in my talk some illustrations of what it means to be fair. And I'm going to cover two areas really in my talk this afternoon. First of all, talking about sustainability and the importance of data preservation, so we ensure that data is still around in 10, 20, 100 years time, even longer. And I'm going to give a case study of one of the repositories that is set out to do that, the Archaeology Data Service, which was mentioned in the introduction, we host in the University of York in the UK. And then I'm going to talk about joining things up and interoperability and how we can find data so we don't drown under the data deluge, but also how we can promote new research, particularly at an international level, and the importance of cooperation, drawing on from our experience in the Ariadne Plus European infrastructure, which is focused on archaeology and heritage, but itself forms part of the social sciences and humanities open cloud, part of the European Union funded IISc, European Open Science Cloud, which is developing infrastructures in many areas within Europe, but with international connections as well. So first of all, just to, I'm sure many of you are not familiar with archaeology, but I wanted to emphasize why this makes quite a good case study. Archaeology has always been quite an early adopter of information technology, whether in the field or the laboratory, and it creates a very rich variety of data types, ranging from the most simple text and spreadsheets and databases through to the more complex geographical information systems, digital imagery, three-dimensional models, laser scanning, and so forth. So it's both a great opportunity to provide access to data, but also a challenge in preserving this data and making it available easily. And it's important to note that, unlike in many disciplines, though it's true in others as well, but archaeological data are often derived from what I call non-repeatable interventions. By that I mean, if you excavate an archaeological site, you are in fact destroying the evidence. You cannot go back and excavate a site again if you think something went wrong or you missed recording something. So there has always been a tradition going back to the pre-digital age that it's essential that archaeologists make a full record of their fieldwork. And we should also note that as we've moved into the digital age, digital data are more fragile than paper data and more subject to obsolescence. So whereas excavations of 100 years ago, for example, done by the Archaeological Survey in India, archived in paper and the physical archive, are still accessible in the traditional archives. Digital data collected much more recently, unless it's been actively curated and looked after, is at high risk. And you can see one of my colleagues in the Archaeology Data Service pondering over an archaeological archive received on some media that are now no longer readable. Very few of us, I think, have a 5¼ inch or 5½ inch floppy disk on our computers. And with the rapid rate of physical storage change, that's a great challenge. But more important is actually what we call the metadata, the information about what is stored in the files on those disks, which enable them to be reused. And the problem as recent years has grown even worse, as now most archaeological data in fieldwork or in the laboratory are often what we call born digital. There isn't actually a paper equivalent that we can go back to. So in big excavations in the UK at the moment, most data is recorded on handheld computers and tablets, and with digital photography. And so it's essential that that is preserved. Our Ariadne infrastructure also looked at this from the point of view of users, and conducted a survey of over 2,000 archaeologists throughout Europe, and asked them what they wanted access to and what the barriers were. So as you can see from the figures there, over 94% agreed that it was important that data sets were made available in an uncomplicated way. Also a high percentage, 87%, researchers agree they often don't know where research data is because it's stored in so many different places and databases. Nonetheless, almost 3/4 considered it was important to have easy access to international data. But in terms of the barriers, there were two main barriers that they saw. First of all, the lack of professional recognition for sharing data that hasn't really followed through from publication through to making your data available. So often not used in promotion processes in universities and so forth. But also at an international level, a lack of repositories, certainly within archaeology, and I think in other disciplines as well. Not so bad in the STEM subjects in the sciences, but this was seen as a barrier to data sharing by some 60% of researchers. So just to tell you a little bit about my own organisation, the Archaeology Data Service, repository for the UK, but based and hosted in the University of York from 1996 onwards. So it's a shared research infrastructure which provides open access data. It's a mandated archive for the UK research councils, those who fund research in UK universities, but also for many of the state heritage bodies, including Historic England, which manages the archaeology of the UK. It's also increasingly used by what we regard as commercial archaeologists from the private sector who undertake most of the field work in the UK, which is sort of privatised and done on a competitive tendering basis. So, for example, at the moment we're archiving terabytes of data that have been produced as part of the transport infrastructure programme for the development of the new railway, High Speed 2, from London to the northwest of England, a great transect across the country. We started with 2 staff, but we're now about 16 staff. And we developed early on a business model for a repository because we haven't consistently received state funding. So our business model is that those depositing data with us pay a one-off charge to deposit their data and have it preserved into perpetuity, but that data is then open access to users. of the data. And this follows a similar approach that is used with physical archives in the UK. Whereas if you're carrying out field work and you're creating a physical archive, boxes of pottery and bone, there is generally a museum charge to store that in the museum. And that charge, obviously, it's not borne by individuals, it's passed on usually to the funders of that research, whether they are research councils or whether they are commercial organisations such as property developers. But that is enshrined within a policy within Europe that goes back to the Valletta Convention. We are what's known as a trusted digital repository. In other words, we're accredited by an international kite mark known as the Quarter Seal, which indicates that people can rely that we will look after their data and won't lose it, that we'll make it available according to FAIR principles. And currently we now provide access to over 1.4 million records for the archaeology of the UK, and that comprises over 70,000 unpublished fieldwork reports available online. There's been a huge problem with what we call grey literature in the UK archaeology sector and indeed throughout the world. We provide access now to over 2,500 full project digital archives. That I mean all the data derived from an excavation, including the GIS, the 3D models, databases, and so on. And we have about 30 terabytes of data, over 3 million files. But most importantly, we actively curate that data. It has to be migrated to new versions of the software. And so we have recorded over 20,000 processes on those files to make sure that they are still readable. And this follows the Open Archival Information System, which was first developed by NASA for their space program to make sure that the data from that was preserved into perpetuity. So I'll just take you through a few screenshots very briefly, but it just helps illustrate the range of functions we provide. And it's really three main functions. We allow users to search the data, we allow them to deposit the data, but also we provide help and guidance on how that data should be, what formats it should be stored in, what metadata should be recorded about it. So if one selects the search data option, that provides access to three catalogues, what we call Art Search System, which is metadata for these 1.4 million records of the archaeology of the UK. But in many cases, then there are much richer data project archives available in the archive search, and also we have what we call a library, but it's a digital library of, as I mentioned, over 70,000 unpublished fieldwork reports, as well as digitized journal articles. So we try to provide a holistic resource for those researching UK archaeology, whether this is members of the public or academics or students. Our deposit section provides guidance on how to deposit data, some of which can be done online via semi-automated system, but for larger archives has to be done by a more hand-tailored system and interaction with our digital archivists. And then we provide, as I mentioned, help and guidance on how you should plan for the creation of digital data, the documentation and metadata that's required. These guides were originally developed in ADS, but then rolled out as international guides. So in a partnership with Digital Antiquity, a sister organization in the United States, repository there, we revamped them. But more recently, they've also been updated through a number of European projects and indeed adopted by other digital repositories in Europe. So there are translations of the guides into Swedish, into German, into French, and also used in Austria. Most recently, colleagues in the Nara Research Institute in Japan have translated them into Japanese. So there is no reason that no matter which country we are in, there is no reason we should be requiring different metadata or different file formats. So this is a good example of international collaboration. And as you can see, they go quite detailed into specific standards for marine survey, laser scanning, photogrammetry, digital audio and video, etc. So just a quick screenshot of our sort of archives page. This is just sort of one way into the ADS archive. So I just took this earlier this week with over 2,500 archives available. See, available for a faceted browse according to the metadata, but then each one of these provides links into an archive. And if we go into, I think it's actually the second one, their site data from a geophysical survey conducted at the Lower Thames crossing point, that takes us to a archive landing page. Note that the archive has a digital object identifier, a DOI, which indicates that it's permanently available and citable by that DOI. And we encourage people to use the that DOI to reference it, so we can see that it's being reused. We have metadata about the spatial area and so forth, information about the funder, and then you can see a series of different downloads that are available, taking you right down to the individual data sets, the GIS shape files and the drawings, for example. And we can demonstrate reuse of this data, the R of the FAIR principles. So here for an archive, you can see since it was released, the number of downloads of files, the number of page views, and in this case, 503 users have actually downloaded files from the archive. And this pie chart shows the users of ADS. You can see that over a third are from education, whether that's higher education or schools, and about 30% is commercial use. So that is archaeological contractors going to ADS to find out information about whether sites that they're working on or nearby have been investigated before. About 12% from national and local government. Oops, right. Let's go back. And then smaller percentages from independent, in other words, sort of amateur archaeologists, which is a large group in the UK, and smaller percentages, interestingly, from what's known as the metal detector community, which is a licensed activity in the UK. It's not illegal, but using our service to find out about archaeological sites, and a smaller proportion from museums. Here's information from another survey carried out by the Research Information Network, looked at the value of a number of data centres from including ADS archaeology, but also British atmospheric data centres and economic data centres and the National Geographic Data Centre and so forth. But the main conclusion of the survey was the value of bringing data together in discipline-based repositories, where there was added value by bringing archaeology data together. So you see the figures there for respondents to the survey said that 84% ADS had had an impact on their data sharing, nearly 80% said it reduced the time required for access and processing, just over half said it provided new intellectual opportunities for them, permitted new types of research, but nearly everyone, 94% at least, said that the data was very or quite important for their research. And this is an independent survey looking at the economic impact of the ADS, and we don't often put a value on the heritage sector. So this was quite interesting. It was carried out by a digital preservation specialist, Neil Beagrie, but also by John Houghton, who was a strategic economist at the University of Victoria in Australia. And the figures that they showed were that there was what they called an investment value of about just over £1 million per annum into ADS when they conducted the survey in 2014, either from the sponsors or contributed by the depositors. So that's them adding value to the data in a sense by preparing the metadata and so forth. But the direct use value of that data, and this is calculated in terms of the savings of time for the users, not having to go to lots of distributed archives and trying to get access to data in planning offices and so forth. So that was higher, 1.4 million. But they calculated further efficiency impacts of between 13 to 58 million per annum. And that equated to 7 hours per person using the ADS per week. And so over a period of about 30 years, they demonstrated that for every £1 invested in our digital repository, there was a £8.30 return. And that's quite an important statistic when you're trying to convince funders of the importance of setting up a repository. So move on to briefly to mention the CIADA cost action, because although we have now a well-established repository in the UK and others in other developed Western European countries, as I mentioned, in Sweden, in Austria, now in the Netherlands, we recognised that there was a very mixed picture of haves and have-nots, even within Europe. And so we established a European-funded cost action, which is really about capacity building. And we have 34, actually that figure is a little out of date now. It's now 44 member countries with 4 international partners, and 18 of the countries are what are known as inclusiveness target countries. They're areas that the European Commission recognised they needed to help build capacity in them. And we published this survey open access in the open access journal Internet Archaeology, which I'd recommend if you're interested in data repositories. I recommend this volume to you because it provides snapshots of the state of play in a wide number of countries, not just in Europe. There's articles on Japan and Argentina, the United States as well, but a lot of articles on the state of play and policies situation for open data in the heritage sector in different European countries. And then lastly, I wanted to introduce Ariadne Plus, the second part of my talk, where the ADS acts as the lead archaeological partner. It's made up of information scientists and computer scientists and archaeologists. They emphasize the importance of collaboration. 23 European countries and 4 international partners, and it provides access to data via an online portal. I won't go into the detail of this slide, but this shows the sort of architecture that underpins it. So with a number of integrated services, with a registry of data sets and metadata schema and mappings to a shared ontology, and these are collected and held in an RDF triple store as linked open data, so that it's not another silo, it links to other linked open data clouds. But we also provide access via a portal which supports cross search and other applications. And this metadata in that layer is collected from data centers throughout the world, so ADS and others, but also subject and domain based repositories and portals, both national and international, and down to individual research projects in universities. There are a number of challenges in doing this. Even within Europe, open access is not necessarily the norm. Some countries tend to be quite restrictive about providing access to heritage data, although that's changed as a result of the GA Charter. But there are also challenges in terms of integrating that data. We're anxious not just to make a great heap of everything, but to provide interoperability so that you can search in a sensible way across multiple data sets and multiple repositories. As I mentioned, there's also the issue of capacity building, and those countries that have easy access to repositories and those that don't. And there are great rewards in terms of then facilitating cross-border searching. In most disciplines, it's not possible to answer some of the big research questions by just looking at the data in your own country. This applies particularly in archaeology. For example, if we're exploring migrations of people in prehistory or trade routes in the more recent period, we need access to data sets from multiple countries and multiple repositories. So how we've gone about this is to agree a shared ontology. And here we use an ISO standard ontology, a framework called the CIDOC CRM, the conceptual reference model. And this provides an object-oriented data structure and shows how different data types are related to one another. So it allows us to provide a semantic web system of knowledge. But in three particular areas, we try and provide interoperability. Most research questions in my discipline, I'm an archaeologist, can be answered by some combination of queries about what data consists of, what its subject terms are, where it belongs to in space. And we use three international standards to ensure interoperability. So we map all partner data sets to the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus. We use American web mapping service Periodo to allow temporal mapping so that all archaeologists can define what they mean by a particular period term. So, for example, when the Iron Age or the Stone Age begins and ends in their own region. And we use the ISO standard WGS 84 for latitude and longitude. So this ensures that when we bring data together, it is interoperable. And we develop application profiles, which are subsets of the CIDOC CRM, to use for item level integration at a granular level. So this is the pipeline, or one of the pipelines, to take data in with records in XML, mapping them to our ontology, and also combining them with mappings to the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus, enriching that with period O information, and then putting it into a triple store, which is held in GraphDB. So this is linked open data, so it can be used by many applications. But one of those applications is our own portal, which I'll briefly demonstrate now. All right, actually, first I'll just show you one view of the subset of the data in the triple store in GraphDB, where we now have over 180 million triples, so an awful lot of data in there. But this is the human interface to the data, the portal way in. Looks at this level a bit like Google. You're searching over 3 million resources, and you can just indeed type anything into there and search all fields. But you can also take advantage of the systematization of our data by, for example, searching on time period or using a Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus subject term. And this is the view then after you've done a search of the data in the portal, the series of filters down the left-hand side with a spatial filter, a timeline filter, but also subject filters by subject type and resource type and who's provided the data, and then just a great list of data sets which can be filtered on with links to the individual metadata for those resources. So I'll give you some examples. This is a filter by publisher, so you can see the wide variety of organizations providing data into Ariadne. And these range from the earliest prehistory, so this is data from the rocky collaboration based at the University of Heidelberg, but they collect data for the earliest prehistory, early hominids throughout the world, including Southeast Asia, India, etc. And you can see there the time range for that. And at the other end of the scale, a small data set, but provided by the Institute of Archaeology, Vasily Hahn in Romania, who have a data set on communist agricultural system traces in Dobruja, those communist farms. So from the most recent end of Cold War archaeology. And just to provide an example, filtering by fieldwork reports published by my own repository, that shows you the sort of heat map distribution of where that fieldwork's being carried out. We can drill down to an individual archive, showing you where it is. There's the metadata for it. We can click on the DOI link, which then takes us down to the ADS site with the landing page for that archive. And again, as I showed you before, now away into the downloads, the data types and the digital images taken for that fieldwork. So to summarize, excuse me, as I've tried to show, digital data preservation is quite onerous. It has a cost, but trying to recollect data or losing data is much more expensive. But if you make data available as open data, it is reused, and studies show both the research benefit and the economic return. And in my own discipline in particular, archaeology is an expensive activity to collect data through fieldwork, but it's also a destructive activity. So digital preservation is even more important. And projects need to support the data reuse life cycle. I've also hoped to show you the benefit of using existing research infrastructures and repositories, but also the benefit from having data available via linked open data in what I call multiple shop windows for different audiences, and to make the same data available according to the needs of the users. Okay, that's my final slide. Thank you very much for your attention. Those are some links to some of the things I've been talking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Richard. This was very fascinating, and also, to be honest, we learned a lot about how to curate the data as well, because we're always talking about the FAIR principles. Also, we're talking about the metadata, but the way you described it shows the structure. In your last slide, obviously, you showed the advantages. There is a question that we have is, in the open data debate, one of the major challenge or a question comes that, I mean, I have put my data out and then somebody else will use it or maybe even commercialize that data. Then how do you see that question being tackled?
So you, I'm not sure I understand. You mean that is it a problem that people would make commercial use of the data? Could you
because
expand what you mean?
Yeah, what I mean that when we ask, like even in our research question also, when we try to ask the researcher, will you put your data on, I'm not talking about the archaeology, but many of the STEM fields, that if you put the data out in the open in some repositories, even after publication as well, but then your data will be used maybe by some commercial companies, they will pick up your data, will make a product and you won't get a profit. Is this a problem for you? And they say yes.
It's not a problem for me. I can see that it can raise issues in some disciplines, but of course, I mean, I think the Creative Commons licensing system was mentioned earlier today, and it is possible to license what people can do with your data. So, for example, in most archaeology repositories, data is made available under what we would call a CC0 license, which is totally unrestrictive, or most commonly with a CC BY license, so that reusers are required to acknowledge where they got the data from. But that does allow commercial reuse, and in a way that does underpin the G8 Charter, because the idea there was, the underlying principle is that data should be made freely available for commercial benefit. And so in my own discipline, it's an advantage that the results of archaeological fieldwork, which are generally collected with public money, should then be made more widely available, so that developers are aware of what archaeology is likely to be threatened by, for example, a new road or new housing development. So I'm very much in favour of data being open for commercial use. Sometimes it is possible and may be necessary to embargo data for a few years, so that the creator can maximise their own benefit from that, and that's totally reasonable. I hope that does answer your question.
Sure, that answers. I mean, obviously it's a little bit become philosophical who wants to do it or not, but then when it's publicly funded, then obviously our researchers have an obligation. So we'll move forward to the next question from the Q&A session. There's a question that I mean, the data repository in archaeological field has already been there, as you have mentioned. So is there any discovery that came out that which primarily used the data that is available in those repository, let's say without doing any excavation or anything?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it gets to the heart of the FAIR principles and the R of reuse, which is that I think most repositories find is the most elusive and the most difficult of these to measure, because it's often very, although as I showed in our graphs, we can chart lots of people downloading data, we don't necessarily know what they do with it, because we don't require them to register and log in. We ask them to let us know what they've done, but that's not always the case. We also are very active now in trying to encourage people to cite data using DOIs, but this requires a culture change, I think, in most disciplines, because there is not necessarily a tradition of data citation in the same way that we would cite other publications that we reference and have drawn upon. So I think there's a sort of international need to increase that. So our information about people reusing data and making new discoveries based on it largely is anecdotal. We do have some of those. So for example, an American researcher who used data from an archive on Roman settlement in Britain and actually applied it in the Americas to a big data study of the emergence of complex civilizations, which was quite an interesting one. And we do have lots more, and we have a lot of now PhD students that, rather than having to collect their own data, which can often take up several years, they are reusing data from archives. As I mentioned, given archaeology is destructive, it's far better, rather than go out and destroy another archaeological site, it's far better to use data that's already been collected by others. So but it's a good question, and a challenging one.
Thank you for actually answering it in such a way that we do understand exactly what's happening, and definitely thanks a lot. I would take up just a last question. I mean, maybe that would not take much time, so then we will end the session. So the question is that do you see any such initiative of such repository in the archaeology from India or South Asia? Because we also have a very long historical perspective, so maybe a lot of archaeological data maybe a lot of excavation. Is the data
Yes,
available?
and I was hoping that you or someone else in the audience might know more about this than I do. I'm not aware of any national initiatives. I believe, but I don't know any details, that the Archaeological Survey of India is now thinking about digital archiving, but we have at the moment no contact with them.
Okay.
But
we
yeah,
also
maybe
don't
someone.
know, actually. I guess that's why the question came up. But
Right.
thanks a lot for such a wonderful presentation. And it actually gives the perspective of open research data, which is also one of the part of this conference. And in the South Asian region, we were discussing that we need to have more and more data available openly to tackle various challenges the region face. So your example shows a very good pathway that there a lot can be done. Thank you very much, and so thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a nice
Bye-bye.
day.
Bye-bye.
Bye. And so thank you, audience, for joining us today. And we end our session, the second day of Ocean. And tomorrow we will again join back at 10 a.m. With another workshop where a collaborating writing platform will be shown by Author Cafe. They have developed some collaborating writing platform where a lot of, which can be many features there can be useful for us as in researchers. So I hope that we will see you all tomorrow. Thank you all. Bye. Have a nice evening.